All right, welcome to the second episode of Cinemapod, led as always by your host, Benjamin Weingard, assistant professor at Hillsdale College, and in a position of clear inferiority,
Bo
Bo
Weingard,
Weingard.
still unemployed. We should say we've moved all of the non-cinema related content to Cephalopod, which will be the other podcast that we do. So this one is exclusively devoted now to cinema, hence the appropriate name, Cinemapod.
Yes. Are you still in an undisclosed location, or have they found it?
It has not yet been disclosed, according to my sources.
All right. So we're going to discuss the film Halloween from 1978.
Not
today.
To be confused with the two other Halloweens that have now been made, 2018 and Rob Zombie's Atrocity.
That's not fair. Rob Zombie really understood the essence of Halloween.
Yes.
So just to start, obviously, Halloween was directed by John Carpenter, who also directed such films as...
Well, so let's start. I'll read a brief summary of the
film.
You
want to be egomaniacal
yes.
and display your film erudition with another opening monologue?
Yeah, per usual, I'll give a very brief monologue about Halloween so that viewers who haven't seen the movie can understand what we're discussing, and those who have can refresh their memories. So
then we'll proceed and just ignore your reading and then do the normal podcast.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
So on Halloween night in 1963 in the small town of Haddonfield, Illinois, a young boy, Michael Myers, inexplicably murders his elder sister, Judith. He's incarcerated in Smith's Grove Sanitarium, and Dr. Loomis, an unusual psychiatrist with a, shall we say, philosophical sensibility and a penchant for purple prose, is assigned to treat him. After a number of years, Loomis begins to believe that Myers is not simply a disturbed child, but is instead a kind of metaphysical force, a manifestation of pure evil. And Loomis dedicates himself to making sure Myers remains locked away. However, 15 years after being incarcerated, Myers escapes. Loomis believes that he is heading back to Haddonfield to continue the slaughter he began in 63 and pursues him, while warning the local police that their town may be awaiting a bloodbath. Meanwhile, Laurie Strode, a shy, bookish teenager, and her friends, Andy and Linda, make Halloween plans, coordinating their evening babysitting duties around booze and boyfriends. As Loomis predicted, Myers has indeed returned home and is already stalking Laurie and her friends. Will they survive this night of babysitting? Can Dr. Loomis stop Myers? Is Myers indeed pure evil? Is Loomis an eloquent metaphysician or a misguided and paranoid shrink? Is Halloween a moral fable about the dangers of teenage sex? A clever retelling of Moby Dick? A slick and effective thriller? Or just a silly slasher film? We will discuss and answer all of these compelling questions and more.
First, I'd say I think that Carpenter is more of Loomis is more of a ontologist than a metaphysician.
Isn't ontology metaphysical though?
Basically, yes.
Yes, he is a clever ontologist, we shall say.
So Carpenter then, we'll get into Deborah Hill and other people associated with the film momentarily, but just to note, Carpenter, very famous director, directed such films as Assault on Precinct 13, The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing, and Dark Star was his, not his first film, but I think it was his second film. It was a short film.
He also had probably more germane for this in some ways. He had I think it was for television, a film called Someone's Following Me.
Interesting.
Yeah, and if you look at that, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I saw scenes from it, and there are definitely you can track the stylistic lineage from that to Halloween.
Okay,
So
he,
Carpenter has this brilliant early career when
yeah,
he makes masterpieces, Halloween and The Thing, which are two legitimate masterpieces.
yes, and I'd say Assault on Precinct 13 is not a masterpiece, but it does display some of his talent. It's an early illustration of the talent that he did possess.
Yeah,
And Carpenter, known for his ability to create unsettling atmospheres, slow burn type films,
yeah,
has kind of an anti-authoritarian sensibility. Halloween is well known for its minimalism, use of a lot of natural lighting, claustrophobic framing, the innovative music score that we'll obviously get into, and then
yes.
the indestructible killer.
Should be
And it's
noted that the musical score, if you listen to Suspiria, and there's a theme for The Exorcist, and both of those you can see the large heavy influence on Carpenter's Halloween score.
okay. So Halloween is considered, I would say, the kind of probably the earliest true slasher
Yeah, so
film.
there's a lot of debate about what constitutes a sort of traditional slasher, and then
Right.
which film counts as the first slasher. It's clearly the case that there were movies that are similar to the sort of slasher film before Halloween, right? So, for
Yes.
example, even going back to Hitchcock's Psycho, which is what, 1960?
Yes.
Yeah, and then I think the closest one to a pure slasher would be Bob Clark's Black Christmas, which came out in 74.
Right. So let's just note kind of the evolution of horror that serves as a background for Halloween. So obviously we have our classic early horror Hollywood movies, right? Like
Right.
Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein,
Dracula,
Dracula. There's I think,
Wolfman.
yeah, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, Jekyll and Hyde. Psycho is an important film for myriad reasons, but it's
Yes.
extremely important in the development of what would become the slasher because of its themes of voyeurism and the interconnection between violence and sexuality.
Yes, and also the tension that Hitchcock created in that film, which Carpenter clearly was heavily influenced by,
Yes.
is quite different from a lot of these other horror films that we're brought up. Dracula,
Yeah.
the famous like Frankenstein movies. They aren't scary or even really tension filled at all. I mean, they're enjoyable enough, but
Oh,
Psycho's the one that I mean people really went to for understanding how to create tension.
yeah. And now it's noteworthy that a lot of the new wave horror directors, including Friedkin, Craven, and Carpenter, one thing that they didn't like about Psycho was the ending, because they thought the explanation of this character
Right.
made it much less
So
scary.
so in Psycho, there's this heavy-handed explanation of Norman Bates, who's the killer in Psycho.
Yeah, very
Eh,
Freudian.
Yes, a very Freudian influenced. It's almost like a coda to the film. They explain what happened and how he took on like the characteristics of his dead mother, whom he had preserved.
Mhm.
And this is important because Carpenter didn't like that. And as we'll see when we discuss Halloween, very explicitly goes out of his way to go the other direction
Yes,
and have no explanation for his killer.
correct.
So Psycho, but really importantly, I would say Black Christmas, which is a
Well, we'll get,
underappreciated film.
yeah, agreed, and we'll get to that because I'll note. So you have Psycho. You also have Peeping Tom that comes out in the same year, 1960, directed by Michael Powell. which has voyeuristic themes and
Yes.
sexuality. But it's also important to understand in setting the backdrop for the more traditional slasher films, such as Halloween. You also have the Hays Code is declining, right?
Yeah. So
So you
what's the
can
Hays Code?
the kind of draconian rules about what you can show in your films.
Right. So
And
all of these rules that, I mean, they had some that were just absolutely what we would consider silly now. Like the criminals, the bad guys could never have bigger guns than the quote police or whatever. There were all of these rules that were quite in some ways oppressive, although you could argue that the very oppressiveness compelled creative solutions that were interesting, right? Because you have these rules that you have to somehow work within the constraints to create your film.
right. So one consequence of the decline of the Hays Code is you get these exploitation films emerge,
Right.
including splatter films, the most famous of which is Herschel Gordon Lewis's Blood Feast from
Right.
1963, which is not a well-made film at
No,
all.
no, it is not.
Very little artistic merit, but very explicit in its portrayal of gore. Right?
Yes.
There's an attempt to realistically portray blood and bodily dismemberment.
Yeah, you might say like Lewis's film would be like, I don't know, the Hostel of the time, except for Hostel's actually more well made, but it was that attempt simply to shock viewers.
Yeah,
There's
just
no real aesthetic merit to the film otherwise.
correct. So it's just these kind of shock films. Now, importantly, you also have the Italian Giallo films, these actually extremely well-made horror films that were, well, not quite horror. They're kind of crime procedurals or murder mysteries that are interlaced with eroticism and psychological horror.
Mhm.
And they also, importantly, often feature unidentified killers murdering in a grand fashion.
Right.
Probably two of the most famous of the Giallo films are Mario Bava's Bay of Blood, which was basically copied and turned into Friday the 13th,
Right.
and Dario Argento's Deep Red. And then, so we mentioned,
Also, Suspiria's in there, which is a slightly different kind of film, but isn't it?
yes,
That's an Italian film that was
yep,
clearly influenced Carpenter.
yeah. And so in this kind of milieu, we get a group of what we would consider like kind of the new wave or new Hollywood horror that included films such as The Exorcist in 1973, uh, Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, and The Hills Have Eyes
Yep.
in 72 and 77. Rosemary's Baby was probably the opening salvo of this.
Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. Yep.
Yeah. And then two really important films that also come out: Carrie in 1976 by Brian De
Palma.
Palma,
Yep.
and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in
Yes.
1974.
Which is Toby Hooper's masterpiece.
And before we get to Black Christmas, just one more thing that's important, I think, noting the trajectory here. Um, the scholar Richard Nowell has made, I think, a compelling argument that one important aspect of the development of the slasher that gets underplayed is that the economics of the film industry were changing. So if you look at some of the earlier new wave horror, they were kind of had like these family type settings like Rosemary's Baby did. And the economics weren't very good for filmmakers on those. But one area that was booming at this time was the teen sex or date movie, right? That was like this market that could be exploited, specifically targeting young female film goers. And so Newell notes from doing an analysis of the way that these films were marketed, that if you start it with Carrie,
Mhm.
Halloween, Friday the 13th, they all really made a effort to target female audiences, right?
Interesting.
And into that, you can see the important role of Deborah Hill, who writes the teenage girls in Halloween.
Right. So it's right. So it's a good question. Like, who's the audience for Rosemary's Baby? Right.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not clear who is. So what you're doing, what the slasher film eventually did was it wedded, and interestingly, the kind of Porky's film,
Right.
right? The teenage sex screwball comedy almost,
Yep.
with the interesting, killer film. Perhaps, I mean, interesting, not interesting, whatever. But like the somehow some person is stalking people
Yes.
and put them together, and
Right.
all of the. So some people consider Black Christmas. I'm sorry. Some people consider Chainsaw Massacre to
Yes.
be like the original slasher film in some ways. And let's not get too scholarly here until later. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre sets some of the rules that people consider like the rules of the slasher that Scream would explicitly discuss, right? It
Yes.
has a final female survivor,
Yes.
but it doesn't have certain features that you might consider the quintessence of a slasher film. Black
Correct.
Christmas, on the other hand, which came out in 74, in which John Carpenter was definitely influenced by, has pretty much every feature you would consider important. In fact, I don't see why Black Christmas wouldn't be considered one of the first slasher films. Now, it's clear that Halloween was the one that got enough attention and that other people watched and were influenced by. But
Yes.
Black Christmas is like that obscure scholar that really came up with like the ideas that Adam Smith popularized. Because
Right.
Black Christmas has a killer who it has a lot of point of view shots,
Yep.
a mysterious killer, people, specifically women in a house, getting picked off by the killer.
Also powerful and I would say, well, empowering roles given to young women.
Yeah. So it has a lot of these features. Now,
Yes.
getting to Halloween, before we get too scholarly, maybe we want to get more scholarly toward the end. We're getting to Halloween. So this was actually, so Carpenter makes Assault on Precinct 13,
Yes.
which I haven't seen. I think you have seen. I've seen
Yes.
parts of it. It displays a talented director, especially on a low budget.
A gritty kind of realism.
Right, a
too.
gritty realism, a talented director who Carpenter also was writing scripts at this point.
Yeah.
The producer, Irwin Yablans, and Mustafa Akkad, I think Yablans had this idea. There's debate about how this came to be, but
yes,
I think the most straightforward story is Yablans had this idea about, or there was this idea about, hey, we want to have a psycho killing babysitters.
Yeah, the babysitter murders.
It was called the Babysitter Murders, and Carpenter agreed to do this if he could have complete artistic control over it, which is very important because Carpenter's like aesthetic is all over this film.
Yes.
Completely dominated by Carpenter.
It allows Carpenter to be an auteur.
Right, exactly. This is like definitely the product of an auteur.
But it's important to give Yablans the credit, not just for the idea of babysitter murders,
right, for Halloween.
but for the idea that it would take place on Halloween. Right. And Yablans realized that there hadn't been a movie entitled Halloween,
right,
which is just batshit crazy.
Right, that's amazing. And now after Halloween, pretty much literally every single holiday became a slasher film.
Yes.
April Fools, like President's Day, every day was getting a murder. Santa Claus became a killer.
Multiple Christmas
Multiple Christmas
attempts. Yes.
Santa killers. So yeah, Yablin says, let's do this on Halloween.
Yeah, so
this is a cool idea. We'll name it Halloween.
And Mustafa Akkad is the financer. So they formed this company, this Compass International Pictures.
Right. So this is unfortunate for fans of the first movie. For the later installments, it's really the creative force behind Halloween ceases to be Carpenter and becomes Akkad, which is unfortunate because Akkad has no interest in art house cinema.
No, Akkad clearly doesn't understand anything about Halloween.
Right.
He just wants to make fucking cash.
Right. He's like, dude, I want Myers in the film killing people, and that's that. That's enough.
Some sex, Myers rips shit up, throw the movie out there.
Right. So thankfully, the first one, though, Carpenter and his then girlfriend, Deborah Hill, have complete artistic control over it.
Also important is the cinematographer, Cundey.
Dean Cundey, right.
Yeah, Dean Cundey.
Absolutely brilliant.
Who went on to work with Carpenter in subsequent films. And also, he got a lot of the kind of the tone and the feel for the film came from Chinatown, that's right. Yeah, the color palette, etc.
Which is like clearly like a blue. The light is always kind of eerie bluish, and then there's a lot of blue orange complementary colors. It's a really nice looking film.
Yes.
So there are all these things going on. There's a lot of scholarship about this film. It really is. If it's not the first slasher film, it is like Adam Smith to free market economics. It is the film that other directors were influenced by, and it just spawned this endless supply of slasher films, many of them of very, very subpar quality. Friday the 13th, for example. But maybe we can let's talk about the film, go through it, and then we can talk about all of these interesting questions about what's the film about, how do other slashers work, etc.
So before getting into the film, I'll just note a couple reviews at the time. And as with Dirty Harry, I have decided to pick quotes from Pauline Kael and Roger Ebert.
Right.
Also a theme. Kael's review, it's also clear that she's unable to read the Halloween film, as she similarly misread, in my view, Dirty Harry.
Yeah, she seems spectacularly good at misreading films.
Yes, quite amazing. So here's the snippet from her review is, quote, Halloween has a pitiful amateurish script by Carpenter and his producer Deborah Hill. An escaped lunatic wielding a kitchen knife stalks people in a small Midwestern town, and that's about it. There's no indication of why he selects any particular target. He's the boogeyman, pure evil, and he wants to kill. And then she later notes, quote, for no discernible reason, the boogeyman zeroes in on her, Laurie Strode, near the start of the picture, but he keeps being sidetracked. He has no trouble when the lights go down, picking off the teenagers who, quote unquote, fool around. Only Laurie has the virginal strength to put up a fight.
Yes, and she also said the film is basically, it's completely bereft of any novel ideas, which I think people would find risible now because we see that as sort of like the prototype for the slasher film.
Yes.
But she thought it was just Carpenter had stolen from other people. Obviously. Especially
Hitchcock and De Palma.
Right, and De Palma, yeah. So she basically thought this was just a completely mindless bricolage, if you will, in the terms of Claude Lévi-Strauss, just taking all of these cinematic techniques, squashing them together with this stupid script that Kael clearly doesn't understand, as we'll talk about.
That's what I think is important about her review, is that to her, the script is amateurish because there's no discernible reason for Michael Myers' actions.
Right.
Ebert, on the other hand, was quite laudatory. So he says Halloween is an absolutely merciless thriller, a movie so violent and scary that, yes, I would compare it to Psycho. It's a terrifying and creepy film about what one of the characters calls evil personified. I would just note here, when you read this review and you read this so violent and scary, for a modern film goer, that's no longer true. We're so inured to on-screen violence, sexuality, and horror that this film seems tame now. But it's important to keep in mind that at the time, it was actually quite horrifying to people.
Right. And also, so the film was this very low budget film.
Yeah. $300,000.
Right. And the initial reviews were largely negative to neutral.
Yep.
It was really Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert's very positive reviews, at least in a retelling. I mean, audiences had kind of liked it, and it started a word of mouth.
Yeah, when it was first shown in Kansas City, and it started to pick up steam there.
But Siskel and Ebert in the critical community, as we see, Cale's review was very negative. Siskel and Ebert gave it very positive reviews. Siskel gave it 3.5 out of 4 stars. Ebert gave it 4 out of 4 stars. And one of the reasons this was compelling testimony about the film is because both Siskel and Ebert hate horror films.
Yes.
a lot of horror films, at least, especially Siskel. I mean, he criticized anything, but he just couldn't handle terror, and he found
it morally despicable.
Yeah, morally just exploitative, and
infamously, they before Friday the 13th came out, right? They released the name of the killer and spoiled it for people.
Yes, that's right. And I remember Siskel's review to Friday the 13th 6 was basically, it's the least objectionable in this like morally abominable series. So the fact that they gave this good reviews was important in the sort of intellectual community. So the film went on to I was going to say make a killing, but that's a terrible pun. So I apologize for that.
You have to embrace the pun, man. Don't run.
It made a lot of money in its theatrical run. So those are the reviews. I would argue that even Ebert didn't really understand the film that he was watching. And that's more interesting even than Ebert really just focused on how the pure visceral feeling of watching it, right? If you look at his review, he said, this isn't an intellectual thing. This is a visceral film. You just get in it and it works because it makes you afraid, tense, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that as background, let's jump into the film.
Yes.
So it starts on Halloween night of 1963.
Yes.
And
well, actually, before that, let's even note the credits. The opening credits are right away. You have this pumpkin, right?
Oh, yes. And
then
get the
you
theme.
Have the theme music. Now, the theme music is this famous 5/4 piano dissonant sounding piece that Carpenter himself scored.
Yep.
If you go and you listen to Suspiria or you listen to The Exorcist, you can see the influence there. But it is an amazingly tension creating, because it's just it's dissonant, right?
Yeah.
So it's a great soundtrack. There are other pieces in the soundtrack or sounds in it, but that's the main Halloween theme.
It's a very eerie sound, and I remember in high school I couldn't play the keyboard a lick, but I remember learning how to play this and thinking it was awesome.
I learned how to play this on guitar. It was so awesome. So yes.
It's for the average person, the soundtrack and the film are completely linked, right? They're inextricably linked together.
And I think that Carpenter, whose father was a professor, I believe a musicologist, he has a particular and like I think what you would call a cohesive aesthetic.
Yeah.
An aesthetic sensibility that's minimalist. So his soundtracks are famously minimalist. There's
Yes.
not a lot there. It's very effective. And actually, like, his films are generally minimalist as well.
Yeah.
It's not terribly elaborate. It just relies on excellent composition. It's not gimmicky really,
Right.
but it is classical and aesthetically pleasing.
And I'd say with the musical score, one thing that's interesting is Carpenter is clearly aware of his limitations and
Yes,
understands
right.
that he's not going to compose complex pieces.
Right. Yes.
But what he's really good at is coming up with riffs,
yes,
catchy
right.
riffs.
In the way that AC/DC, they're just going to make a great rock song with 4 chords. John Carpenter is going to come up with some kind of like interesting riff, theme, leitmotif that just plays over and over with a little bit of elaboration here and there, but not much else.
Yeah, the Halloween theme is like it's to movies what Smoke on the Water is to guitar play.
Yes, it is.
So we start with the opening scene, 1963 Halloween night, and this is one of the more famous scenes from the film because it's this long tracking shot that lasts for about three or so minutes, right? So, and it was clearly, and the Carpenter acknowledges as much, influenced by the opening tracking shot in A Touch of Evil by Orson Welles.
Yes, so it's a POV. We don't know whose POV it is. And interestingly, Black Christmas 1974 starts with a POV shot as well. But this one's different because this one it's more well done. It's got the Panaglide or steady cam technology at this point. So you can do this tracking shot without a dolly.
Yes.
And it doesn't vibrate around. It doesn't make random movements. And so we follow this POV. We see this girl making out with somebody in this house, and we hear somebody. I think they're saying, "Where's Michael?" or "He's around here somewhere." Right. So we imagine that this POV must be Michael, whoever Michael is.
Yeah.
It goes on. It goes into the house.
It goes around through the back.
Right. Through the back into the house. Opens a drawer and grabs a knife.
Yep.
And then the hand, it looks like a child's hand or a young person's hand.
Actually, fun fact, Deborah Hill's
hand. It is Deborah Hill's hand. Now here's the first, we'll see throughout this that time is a kind of relative thing in the Hollywood universe, Halloween universe, excuse me. So this woman and this boy, this teenager had gone upstairs, presumably to have sex, and he's putting his shirt back on when we see him next, about a minute later. Yes. So apparently this was a very rapid coital encounter. Yeah, yes. It's true.
So Meyer in this scene then, when the boy runs out of the house, the Myers like hides. We see from his POV, he kind of steps back and hides a bit and then walks upstairs.
Right.
He grabs a little,
but we still don't know who this is, importantly.
Right, that's right. We don't know who it is. So whoever it is walks upstairs, grabs a clown mask, places it on his face so it covers the actual lens of the camera.
Right. And just technically this is important because I think there are 2 cuts in this. It's a long take, but they actually hid cuts. So there's one cut when he puts the mask on, it allows them to cut where you can't see the cut.
Okay, so it's an invisible cut.
Yeah, exactly.
So I didn't notice it, actually.
Yeah. So, and this is a technique that's often used where you hide the cut, as Hitchcock did in Rope, for example. So it looks like one long take. And then he goes into this girl's room. We see this naked girl, and she says, she's like, Michael. And then he starts stabbing her.
Yes. Now, importantly, or maybe not important, but interestingly, when you watch the stabbing in 2020, given how realistic films are now, it really looks
It
preposterous. He's basically stabbing the air.
Yes, it's like so it's a POV, and the POV moves from the sister to like the air, and the knife is just going down. It's clearly influenced by Psycho.
Yeah, the shower scene of Psycho where you
Yes.
see the POV shot with the knife, and it's not even coming close to
Right.
to
Right.
Janet Leigh.
So
Similar here.
the girl falls to the floor and is clearly dead, and then we get, this is Michael, but we don't know who Michael is,
Right.
walks outside, and then we see
He's
it,
a
it
6-year-old
cuts, and it's
boy.
just his parents are coming home, and it cuts to him, and they say Michael, and he's just a 6-year-old boy in a clown suit
Yeah.
holding a bloody knife. Now this is a great shot. It's on a crane,
Mhm.
and it pulls away slowly from Myers, on framed on both sides by his mother and his father. It's a great looking shot, but it's very odd because his
Yes.
parents drive up, see him holding this huge knife that's all bloody. They say Michael, and then they just stand there doing nothing for 20 seconds.
They stand there to allow the
The
camera
really
to move
odd.
out.
Right.
And so it's an example of the aesthetic of the shot being more important than psychological realism.
Right. So, but this is it takes us right into this film. Right away, we have this amazing tour de force shot, a couple of shots actually, this steady cam shot, and then this crane shot,
Mhm.
and this surprise of this 6-year-old killing somebody. And then we cut to Loomis, right?
Loomis and Marion
Right.
Chambers.
So we cut immediately from then to what is presumably 1978, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
we have Dr. Loomis in the passenger seat driving with this woman, and we find out that they're going to transfer Michael Myers
Mhm.
from one place to another because he has to be put in front of a judge. Why you would transfer somebody like at this time, it's not exactly clear, but there is some important dialogue here, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
she says, or he asks her, have you ever done anything like this before? And she says, only minimum security. And then he's basically like, you have to just understand what we're dealing with here, right?
Yes.
And then she says something about how she just doesn't like the gibberish. That's what
Yes.
bothers her. And he's like, you haven't anything to worry about. He hasn't said a word for 15 years.
Yeah, and I like the dialogue from this scene that caught me was he says, Loomis says, quote, just try to understand what we're dealing with here. Don't underestimate it. Marion
Right.
Chambers, the nurse, says, don't you think we could refer to it as him? And then Loomis kind of deadpans, if you say so.
Yeah, if you say so. So he's got this very stern, grave, sincere personality, and he's very, you can tell he's very serious about it. And she even says, "You're really serious about this. You never want him to get out." And he's like,
Yes.
"Never, never, never."
Yes. So I think here, this is a good follow-up establishing scene of we have now the protagonist and the antagonist are pretty well developed
Right.
immediately here.
Right. So it's very, again, in the same way that Dirty Harry will say this again, this is a good, this is where the script is good. It's
Yep.
economical storytelling. We already know what we're dealing with. We have the protagonist Loomis, we have the antagonist Myers. Myers is mysterious. Loomis understands something about Myers that we'll find out other people don't get.
Well, we already find that out here with the Marion Chambers, the nurse character, like she's underestimating him.
Right.
So the
And
point is Loomis is taking this more seriously than any other adult.
right. He understands, and as we'll see, so the scene, what there are a bunch of people out with their white coats in this thunderstorm. So this is like classical horror, right? It's a mental asylum, it's a thunderstorm, they've escaped, Myers gets on the car and steals the car, and we'll get into where did he learn to drive, but
yes. So he steals the car, and then there's one of my favorite lines from the entire film. So Myers takes the car, leaving Nurse Chambers and Loomis carless at the asylum.
Right.
And then Loomis says, he's gone from here. The evil is gone. And he delivers it so over the top, but also brilliantly. It's just a one of those magical lines, right?
And we should say the best actor in this film by far is Donald Pleasance, who's playing Dr. Loomis here. And
Donald Pleasance was the only serious established actor who they could get in the film with their budget.
Right. And we should, I think the thing that Donald Pleasance is so good at in this film is delivering that purple prose, or that sort of portentous prose, in a very serious and earnest way that gives gravity to it instead of making it sound like something metaphysically pompous.
I would imagine if I looked at this script and saw that line, I would think there's no way you can deliver this and be believable. It's so overwrought.
Right. And there's a lot more of his purple prose to come. So it's good that Pleasance is good at doing this. So Myers has escaped. So now, and remember that I've seen this film, I don't know, 15, 20 times. And the thing I think that sticks with me just about the sort of mastery of the dialogue's not particularly good in places, but the story is very effective and it's very quick. Myers kills his sister, 15 years later escapes from a mental hospital, and then we cut to this, and this is what Carpenter did so well in this film. We have these wide shots. So we cut to Haddonfield after this escape. Now we're in Haddonfield. It's actually shot in California, and you can see palm trees, but
it's supposed to be autumn, and obviously it's Halloween again in Haddonfield, Illinois.
Right.
But if you pay any attention at all, you'll notice that none of the leaves are turning color, and there aren't that many leaves on the ground. So what actually on their budget, they couldn't afford to have many leaves. So they throw out some leaves and then they continue to rake them up and recycle them throughout the film.
Right. And they're clearly also they've been painted. So they're weird looking leaves, but we have this just wonderful wide shot that Carpenter will use for the first 25, 30 minutes here when it's day in Haddonfield. And it's this really creepy sort of this is the suburban, this small, or I guess you would say it's a small town life. It almost feels like a David Lynch film. Like if you sort of got rid of Michael Myers here, this would kind of be this eerie, what's beneath the surface in this small town type vibe that you get from this. And you have this wide shots, and then the camera will just track with the characters. So now we're introduced to Laurie Strode, who's played by Jamie Lee Curtis, who was Janet Leigh's daughter. Janet Leigh famously was the victim in Hitchcock's Psycho.
Marion Crane.
In the shower, from the shower scene.
So the connection with Psycho then it becomes stronger.
Explicit. And there are also characters who are named after characters.
We noticed this.
For example.
So we're introduced to Laurie. We're also what you'll notice throughout the film is that it's bereft of parents or adult figures, with the exception of Loomis, and we'll get to Sheriff Brackett. In this scene, we actually do see a brief interaction between Laurie and her father, and her father tells her, place the key at the Myers house because somebody's going to come by to look at it at 10:30.
Right. So Laurie Strode, her father is a realtor. So he's trying to sell the Myers old house. Now, this is interesting too, because this is something that Carpenter he had this idea that every town has this haunted house. And that's what the Myers house is here. And it's this great looking house, just decrepit, dilapidated house. And it will actually play a role throughout. So that's the house where she has to drop the keys.
So we're introduced now to Laurie, and then we're introduced to Tommy Doyle.
Yes.
And Tommy Doyle is the child that Laurie Strode is going to babysit on Halloween night.
Right.
So we're introduced to Tommy and Laura or Laurie, and then Laurie and Tommy walk up to the Myers house. So we get a good view of this decrepit house that looks extremely creepy.
Yep.
And then Tommy just notes that everybody thinks that the house is haunted and that some real awful stuff happened there a long time ago.
Right. And Laurie basically like mocks that, right? And then,
yes, she does.
And Tommy's like, don't go up there, you know, and she's like, watch me or whatever. She goes up there, and then we have this great cut from the inside of the house POV, and we realize somebody's in there.
Yeah, we hear
looking
breathing.
out. Right. Yes. And Myers breathing is a soundtrack, sound production of genius, I would say, throughout the film. So, you know, Laurie goes back out. I think she starts singing a song, and then the Myers had walked out of the house, and we get this over the shoulder shot looking at Laurie. So this sets up, and this is what I people say the movie is boring. I've read people who have argued that, and I just don't understand it, because immediately, so we get the kill, we get the escape, and then immediately we get this guy is going to be stalking these people for the rest of the movie. It's great in that the character development that we get, which I think we do get character development. I don't know what Kale's talking about. We get character development that's takes place while they're being stalked. So it's already moving the tension up a bit, right? Because we know that this is somebody who killed his sister when he was 6 and escaped a mental asylum. We don't know when he's going to do what he's going to do, but we know he's capable of doing something. So I think it's very economical, and it just right away plunges you into this world of these people getting stalked by this crazy killer.
Yeah, and it's also the feel of it when you're watching it is extremely effective, because the way that they do these shots when the teenagers are walking or when Laurie's walking, it's like this smooth glide with the camera, like, and we don't know if that's just how the film is or if that's because somebody's watching them as they're walking.
Right. So that's right. That's the thing, that the POV, the reason POV is great is because sometimes you're like, okay, that's the killer. We're in the killer's POV. Other times we're like, are we the voyeur or are we the killer now? And you don't know. And then another thing Carpenter does very well throughout up until near the end is that Myers being the killer, is often somewhere in the periphery, right? So he'll be in the corner somewhere.
I know, like these wide shots.
Right, these wide shots, and he's somewhere in the corner, or maybe he's not, and then he comes in. We always think he might be out there. Right. So you're always like, where is he? Is he out there? What's he doing?
Yeah, so now, so we're introduced to Laurie and Tommy, and then we have this scene with Dr. Loomis arguing with another doctor as they're walking out of Smith's Grove Sanitarium.
Right.
And this scene is, I think, a little bit preposterous.
Yeah, well, it does. So there are, I mean, the script is in one way, like some of the dialogue I don't like. I like much of the story, but there are some failures. So
yeah,
here,
so Loomis he's having this argument with what appears to be a doctor who's a superior to him, like the head of the sanitarium, and the doctor tells Loomis, look, there's nothing else I can do about this. And Loomis says, you can get back in there and get on the telephone, tell them exactly who walked out of here last night and tell them exactly where he is going. The doctor says, probably going.
Right.
Right? Then Loomis says, I'm wasting my time, right?
Yep.
And then the doctor replies, Haddonfield's 150 miles away from here. For God's sake, he can't drive a car. No, we've already seen that he can. And the movie
Yes.
tries to address this. And Sam responds, that is, the Dr. Loomis responds, he was doing very well last night. Maybe someone around here gave him lessons.
Right. So at least I will say that Dr. Loomis is playing CinemaSins himself here and saying like,
Right.
well, we've got to somehow explain how this person who was locked away for 15 years since he was 6 could drive. Maybe somebody gave him lessons. And
that dialogue, though, honestly begs more questions than it answers.
it raises more questions.
Yeah, so we'll leave the dialogue be, but it's kind of absurd.
Another thing that's absurd, well, that's said that makes what the police officers do more absurd is this guy tells Loomis says to this guy, or I think he says, we put up 2 roadblocks.
Yes.
So clearly these people know that this person escaped. They know what car he has, and it's marked. It's a marked car.
They recognize that he's dangerous enough to put up roadblocks.
Right.
But the doctor refuses to call the police in Haddonfield or any other neighboring cities.
Yeah, so this raises a lot of questions for later in the film, because I think what happened was Carpenter really wanted this to be nobody's helping these people, these kids.
Yeah.
But it's impossible to believe that all of the adults would be as incompetent as they are depicted in the film, with the exception of Loomis. But yeah, so this sets up some things. So we get that, and then we go, I think, directly to Laurie is in a classroom, right?
Yeah, and this scene is, I think, pretty important. Also, note that this is one where the color theme of the scene is green, and it's extremely well done. So like everything in this classroom is green. Laurie is wearing a green outfit, basically like a green sweater.
Mm-hmm.
And even when she looks out the window and sees Michael Myers, it's very lush green and verdant.
Yeah, so it's again, and then this is something that is common throughout the film. It's very aesthetically pleasing, disciplined, minimalistic, but all of the choices, the lighting are brilliant and work together. And we have a teacher, we never see the teacher, but she's talking. And this is important because there's dialogue here. And if you're a good filmmaker, when you have dialogue in a film, even though it doesn't seem as though it's somehow connected to the film, it's important for the film. So
I mean, and I would just note, in this case, it's not very difficult.
No, it's in your face. It's in your face. And actually, it makes this error that annoys me. So we hear the teacher say, fate caught up with several lives here, right? So now we get this theme that will play out about fate.
Yep.
And then Laurie looks out the window, and we have this shot of Myers just standing behind the car. And this is great and very creepy. So she just looked out. She sees this guy who's wearing a white mask. You can't really tell what he's doing. His face looks like a white mask.
Yep.
And we'll find it. That's Captain Kirk's mask that they painted white, cut the eye holes bigger, etc. And this shot is clearly influenced by Psycho. I mean, I believe it's the shot where the actress played by Janet Leigh looks and the cop is standing out of is it a car shop?
The police officer is across the street.
Right.
She's buying a car to kind of blow town.
And so it's like clearly taken directly from Hitchcock, but it's just masterful at just setting up again. There's this guy, he's creepy. He's going to be in these shots and she doesn't know why. And then she'll look out again and he's gone.
Yep.
Right. And then, so, it's very, very high tension, creepy. And then Laurie's asked this question about Samuels, presumably an author or a philosopher, and what these differences of their views of fate.
Yep.
And Laurie explains that Samuels thought fate was like a natural element, as opposed to this other person who thought it was only tied up with religion.
Yeah.
And this is what bothers me. So the teacher says, that's right, Samuels definitely personified fate, which is exactly not what Laurie said.
Right. It's the opposite
It's
of
the
what Laurie
opposite.
said.
But what I was thinking and what I wrote down is Carpenter personifies fate, right? So you can see Myers as the personification of fate, right?
Right. So and the actual line from the teacher is, quote, "That's right, Samuel's definitely personified fate. In Samuel's writing, fate is immovable like a mountain. It stands where man passes away. Fate never changes."
Right. So
Right.
clearly
So,
the opposite of personification.
right, but it's interesting because I don't know if this was like done on purpose or right, this idea that like maybe fate is personified, but maybe it's like this natural element that's not personified. Like it's hard to say.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think obviously though the point, and actually we'll see this again with the train. I love the train. So clearly though, I think that, I mean, they're setting up Myers is the personification of fate.
Yeah.
Right. He's this immovable, pure evil fate, this metaphysical force.
Yep.
And I think we do. Oh no, we don't. We don't cut from there. Well, we'll talk about that. So this scene's in there. Of course, the dialogue a little in your face, but I like this because it's adding a sort of philosophical component to what could just be. And this is why I think, I mean, it's also aesthetically, it's much better done than Black Christmas, but also the thing that I think that elevates this above Black Christmas is this metaphysical, this stuff that Cale hated, right? Like,
Yep.
What is Myers? He has no reason. I like that. I think that's important and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So we cut from that to Tommy. Now this is weird. So Myers goes apparently from, this must be the high school. Now he's at the school where Tommy is.
That's right.
And Tommy gets out of school and these boys surround him. Lonnie is one of them. We'll see him later. And Tommy's carrying a pumpkin and they're yelling at him about how the boogeyman is coming. And they're doing this chant, which again sets up this theme of the boogeyman, which will play over and over again. And one of them trips him. Tommy falls and busts his pumpkin open.
Yep.
And then I think it's Lonnie who runs. And this is a great shot. So Lonnie runs toward the camera. And then you get this, this guy in this jumpsuit.
Yep.
Grabs him. And it's like freaky. And the
Yeah,
kid looks up at him and then just bolts the other way.
Yeah. And when he bumps into the jumpsuited man, which is clearly Michael Myers, but we can only see him from like the middle of the chest down.
That's right.
Because it's at the eye level of Lonnie.
Yes. So we don't see his face. And then they, again, this is, Carpenter is just masterful at this. What we see after this is Tommy walks across the school playground or driveway or something, and or parking lot or whatever. And Myers gets in his car and we just get this slow, Myers is going to follow him for a while we have the Halloween theme playing. Again, some of these themes of voyeurism. Is he identifying with this kid because this kid is 6 years old? Maybe, we don't know, but it's really creepy and effective.
Yes. And then we cut from there to Loomis on the side of the road talking on a payphone.
Yes.
And he's called the police in Haddonfield and he's warning them that Michael is out there. And he specifically says, you know, if you don't warn the people of your town, it's your funeral.
Yeah, he says it's your funeral. Right?
Yeah, and then he slams the phone down.
Now this is bizarre. Like this is where you can see like you're just doing things for the purpose of the script. Why would he use a payphone from 73 miles away from Haddonfield instead of just calling him in from Smiths Grove?
Right. The other thing that's fantastic about the scene is there's a sign that
Yeah.
says Haddonfield 73,
73.
as if this like town of like what 5,000 people, like
Right.
you would have freeway
Podunk town.
signs from 73 miles out. But whatever, it
Right.
you know, it gives us some idea of space.
An effective thing here, though, is there's a we hear a train coming, so he's in this corner of the road, like on the payphone, and then we see a shot of a train coming. Again, I think, I mean, clearly the crew waited for a train to come to shoot the scene.
Yes.
Train probably related to fate coming at you, approaching, and then going away. And we see this. I guess it's a what do you call that? A wrecking truck.
Yeah, it's from Phelps Garage.
Right, that's right, Phelps Garage, and we realize that Myers has been there because Loomis picks up this matchbook,
Yeah,
which was in the stolen car, Rabbit and Red, and then the camera pulls back, and Loomis doesn't see this, but we see there's a dead body that whose clothes have been taken.
Right.
So this is where Myers gets his jumpsuit.
And now, so this is exactly what you were saying with this being in the service of the script. So
yes.
One, it allows Loomis to call the police and warn them. And two, it allows him to discover the matchbook and know that Myers had been there.
Right. But inexplicably, Loomis doesn't look around any further after seeing a wrecked truck and this matchbook. He doesn't look around. If he had, he would have discovered this body. So that's kind of weird.
Yes.
But yeah, I like this scene. I like the train. You know, it's just, again, it's adding more symbolism to a film that could just be ordinary, like psychotic dude goes around to kill babysitters. There's something more, there's more intellectual heft to the film.
Yes. And so after we have this scene, we cut to now we introduce Laurie. Well, we've already met Laurie, but we're introduced to her two best friends, Linda and Annie.
Yes. And this is where I will say the dialogue, in my view, some people have praised the dialogue of these high schoolers for its realism. I find it really annoying, and it's not particularly well done.
So it's important to note that throughout the film, if it feels like you're watching two films, you kind of are.
Yeah.
Because the teenaged babysitters and their scenes were written by Deborah Hill.
Yes.
And the Loomis dialogue was written by Carpenter.
Yes.
So here we switch to and you can see that Deborah Hill's writing this in the vein of kind of these teenage date type movies, right?
Right.
Very youth oriented dialogue, create like use of like humor,
jargon,
teen jargon,
humor in parentheses and ironic parentheses, because it's not particularly funny. I will say the characters are reasonably sympathetic. They are not the sort of disposable libidinous teenagers that we'll get later on, whom we just want to die while cheering for the killer.
And their personalities are also clearly demarcated. So we've got Linda is like this carefree teenager. Annie is this self-confident, forceful,
kind of cynical and bitter also.
And then Laurie's the kind of bookworm.
Right. And Linda has this habit of saying totally. So she's a cheerleader too. So she says totally a lot. And Annie, she's kind of like the bitter, cynical one. So, and she says she calls her boyfriend Paul El Jerko. Yes. Maybe that was lingo. That was cool at the time.
The lingo in Haddonfield.
But I'll give you an example of how bad the dialogue's attempt at humor is. They have this line. So, for whatever reason, Laurie says, what did they say before when Laurie's like, shit, I forgot my book, shit. And then Annie says, I have a place for that.
Yes.
This is supposed to be funny, like she has
so
a
it's scatological humor.
Yes,
That's
and it's
not well done.
not even funny, but we do okay. So we get three, as you say, they are clearly articulated personalities, different characters. Then we get this weird scene. So they're walking. Myers drives by again, which he spends a lot of time driving around stalking.
Yeah, so
people.
he's still stalking them with the station wagon.
Right. And we get this weird Annie says, hey, jerk, speed kills. Now, a couple of things about this. One, Myers is driving about 7 miles per hour.
Right. He's
going,
definitely not going the speed limit.
He's barely going faster than they're walking. Second, he's like 40 yards from them when she yells this, but
Yes.
apparently he hears this, stops, and then squeals off.
Yes.
Now, Laurie, I think we get the sense that she may have recognized this car from earlier, so she's a disconcerted at this point.
Yes.
And Annie says this very bizarre and overly specific line. I hate a guy with a car and no sense of humor. So apparently, if the guy has no car and no sense of humor, that might be okay, or a car plus a sense of humor.
Yes, it's not great writing. I would concur with that.
Very weird here, but I mean, I suppose we can say that the scene is reasonably effective, whatever the problem with the dialogue, and that we do get some sympathetic characters. We get that Myers is still out there stalking them, and we get these slow shots following them as they discuss what's going to happen on the day.
Yes, and then so they drop Linda off at her house, right?
Well, wait a second. You're skipping important scenes because there's a really good scene, is there not, here where we see Myers by the bushes?
That's after Linda gets dropped off.
Oh, Linda, not Laurie. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Linda
gets dropped off.
Linda gets dropped off, and then Annie and Laurie are walking together,
Right.
and Laurie looks ahead, and there's this bravura shot of Myers, like in the distance, halfway out of the hedges.
Right.
And she sees him and is startled.
Right.
And then ask Andy, did you see that? And he's like, I don't know what you were talking about, even though Andy was clearly looking straight ahead, but we'll set that to the side.
Ignore that. So what we should point out in this, as you call it, bravura shot, I don't know if I'd go that far. It's a good shot.
Not the shot, the way that Myers is placed is brilliant.
The way they place him, and they do, again, they do this so well in this movie, and then he's gone. So he's there and then he's gone. And you're like, where did he go? Where is he? And you're always afraid he might come out somewhere.
Yep.
As you say, Annie was definitely looking at it.
Yes.
So, but Annie walks up and says, oh, subtle, isn't he? Because Laurie says this is probably this guy who was following us. Annie goes behind the bush and sees nobody is there. And then here's her sort of cynical bitterness. She's like, hey, Laurie, this guy wants to ask you out. And then Laurie comes, there's nobody there. And then Annie says, poor Laurie scared another one away.
Deborah Hill nailed that dialogue.
Yeah. So, and then Annie leaves after this. But again, so it's great that we have this guy around who's just stalking these people for no apparent reason. He's appearing and disappearing. And as a viewer, it puts you on edge because you're always concerned that he's somewhere. You don't know where he is, but he's just waiting out there. And this is what you would call Hitchcockian, right? Because what Hitchcock said was, this isn't verbatim, but he said something such as, don't show the bomb blowing up. You show the timer on the bomb running, because that's tension, right? You're always like, when's the bomb going to go off? So the same thing here. You're always like, when is Myers going to do something?
And having the characters unsuspecting. builds up the tension as well, because we know that there's something dangerous out
Right.
there, even if the character doesn't.
But importantly, Laurie does. So
Yes,
Laurie's
Laurie
the one
does.
character throughout who knows something is sort of off and pays attention to her surroundings. Whereas Annie and Linda are completely oblivious, so is
Yep.
Bob. Now, some people have argued, and we don't need to get into this too much here, but it's not terribly unreasonable given the way this works, that somehow Myers is a figment of Laurie's like libidinally repressed imagination, a sort of phallic killer. And you can make the argument because she's the only one who sees him and tell the others see him only when they're dying.
Yes.
And he sort of appears and disappears in a way that defies physics. So you could make this argument. Now, I don't think Carpenter intended it that way, but you can read it that way. So that's another thing to point out there. So Annie goes off, and then we have one of two of these in the film that I really dislike, and I wish they would just cut these. And then other horror films did these way more often, namely the stupid jump scare.
Yeah, the lazy jump scare.
Right, it's so lazy, and the jump scare relies on this fictitious film world because it would never work in the real world, because what happens is you have it shot and edited in such a way that one character sneaks up on the other in a way that you could never do in the real world.
Right, it works by having the frame like zoomed in on a small area.
So you have a closed frame and you have the other person out of the frame. So she bumps into Annie's dad, Sheriff Brackett.
Yes.
In a way that, of course, could never happen, but whatever.
And their dialogue is not even worth getting into.
Well, he does use the line that's recycled in H2O. He says, "It's Halloween. I suppose everyone's entitled to one good scare," which is used by Janet Leigh, says this in H2O. So whatever, yeah. So, but we do get Sheriff Brackett, who's a character who will come up again.
Yes.
So Laurie keeps going. She's a little bit nervous at this point, right? Because we hear people making noises, and then she's like kind of concerned, and we find out they're just trick-or-treaters. Now, these trick-or-treaters, talk about early trick-or-treating, right?
Dude, it's 3 p.m. You got to get a jump on that.
Right. So they're out at 3 p.m. and Laurie says to herself, "Well, kiddo, I thought you outgrew superstition." So we can tell that she's kind of upset, right?
Yes. And she goes up to her room.
Yep.
And there's another great shot where she looks out the window and sees Michael Myers, who's kind of occluded partially by these sheets that are out on hung over a clotheslines.
Right.
And then she looks again and he's gone.
Right. So defying the laws of physics, he's managed to skedaddle in like 3 seconds.
Yes.
Because we have a shot and then the cutaway to him.
Myers also preternaturally good at understanding when somebody is looking at him.
Yes, he throughout the film he evinces a talent for understanding when eyes are upon him.
Yes.
So but again, it's disconcerting because we know Myers is out there, and Laurie does. Unlike the other characters, Laurie realizes somebody's out there. She's not sure what, but she's disconcerted by it. Then she gets this phone call. This is another kind of stupid one, but this is interesting because Black Christmas, the killer in Black Christmas, would make these phone calls to these women that were really creepy.
Yes.
Actually, Black Christmas basically plays off of the old urban tale. What do you call those?
Urban legend.
Urban legend. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah. The urban legend of the creepy phone calls. And then you trace it and the cop says to you, the calls are coming from your own house.
Right.
Black Christmas plays on that. And it has this very creepy sounds with the phone calls. And you can see Halloween uses phone calls at various times to add suspense or kind of make it creepy. And it's almost as if you can see like they integrate it into this movie when they really didn't need to, and it doesn't
it
really
doesn't
do
add
a lot.
anything. So in this case, there's a call, you hear some like annoying chewing sound,
Right.
and then it hangs up, and then the person calls back and it's just Annie.
Right. And
Right.
then
There's no need for this.
right. And she
really.
says, "Why did you hang up on me?" So she apparently calls her friends with a mouthful of cereal.
Yes.
Doesn't say anything. And Laurie's freaked out because she'd just seen this creepy guy in her backyard,
Yeah.
and then hangs, then she's like, "Why would you hang up on me?"
Yeah.
Gee, I don't know. Maybe because you didn't say anything for 10 seconds. Right. So Annie's gonna pick her up. So they go out
to go babysitting together.
Well, they're gonna babysit, and they're gonna babysit.
They're
across
going to
the
be
street from each other. So
yes. Then we cut to Loomis visiting the cemetery, right?
Is that here? Yes, I guess that is here. Yeah, and I like this scene.
After watching it for this podcast, I will concur. I enjoyed it.
Because I think you argued this could be caught, right?
Yes, I don't. I would rather have the phone calls with Laurie and Annie earlier caught, and we can keep this.
Yes. So the scene, Loomis is with this probably like the grave digger who's talking to him,
who also becomes a trope of the slasher film.
That's right. So if you know,
the drunk grave digger,
Friday the 13th has this character. Actually, he says, "You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you?" So this kind of character. In Halloween, he's not quite to the "you're doomed" yet.
No, I would. Loomis is the Warner in Halloween. We'll get to that.
Yeah, but so this gravedigger is talking to Loomis, and they're going to look for Judith Myers' cemetery stone. And the gravedigger. So again, it's like they don't waste much in this film. So this gravedigger's adding to the sort of overall horror and atmosphere by telling this story about this other person who did this grisly crime.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not able to finish it. And they see this missing gravestone. And the gravedigger says, "Goddamn kids, why do they do it?" As if apparently stealing cemetery stones is a thing that kids do.
Pretty common.
Right, but it's Judith. They figured out it's definitely Judith Myers' cemetery stone is gone. And then Pleasance, in an Oscar-worthy delivery, says, he sort of looks ominously and he says, "He came home."
Yep.
Now it's such a, it's obviously one very simple sentence, but damn it if Pleasance doesn't deliver this with panache.
I would argue the evil is gone from here is better, but
possibly. I like this one because it's less like emphatic. It's more of this resigned matter-of-fact assertion of what he thought was the case.
Right. And now as a ontological matter, we know that that evil has left Smith's Grove and evil is now present in Haddonfield.
Evil is present, fate is present in Haddonfield. And that's what this tells. I mean, now we already kind of knew this, but now Loomis definitely knows it. And we know Myers is peculiar because he stole his sister's cemetery stone, which will be displayed later.
Yes. And then we cut from there to a scene with Annie picks Laurie up, and they're both, importantly, both of them are tweaking the joint. That's important.
This is weird to me because I can't tell if I thought it was just a cigarette. I didn't know it was supposed to be weed. It doesn't.
Yes, it's definitely ganja.
Okay, so and what's weird about this is nobody says it's not even treated as a thing. She just gets in the car and they take a few tweaks of this J.
Yeah.
And then Annie says, "Oh shit, like it's my dad." And at this point, they're hundreds of yards from her dad.
Yes.
Who's at this store,
hardware store.
Right. And it's like, okay, if I had just hit a few tweaks of a J and I saw my dad, who's a sheriff, hundreds of yards ahead, I would just drive by and say no thanks.
So I can't I couldn't confirm this, but I read a source that said the scene with Annie and Laurie driving together was actually directed by Deborah Hill, and it was added as a filler so that the running time of the film would be longer. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's definitely Deborah Hill's writing, and the direction is just a shot of them inside of the vehicle.
It's a shot it's interesting because they have in these scenes they have the shot from the hood looking in. They have two shots, one on Annie, a close up, and one on Laurie.
Yep.
Later the shot moves to the cameras move to the back of the car. But yeah, I mean, it's just, it's whatever. It's traditional.
No, we do know
direction.
That as they're driving, they are also being followed by Myers, although they don't notice it.
They don't notice it. Now, in this scene, again, this is a great scene, although some of it doesn't make sense, but there are some great things about it. So they pull up to talk to Annie's dad, Sheriff Brackett, who's in front of this hardware shop with a ringing alarm. And he's saying, damned kids. And she's like, well, why would you blame it on kids? And he says, well, the only thing that was stolen from the hardware shop was like a rope, a knife, and a mask.
Yeah.
So now we know where Myers got his mask. But what's perplexing about this is that Myers has been stalking these women with his mask for hours now.
Yes.
So was the alarm ringing for hours and nobody attended to it? Or it's unclear how that happened.
It is very unclear chronologically what is going on.
Yeah, the chronology, the timing in the movie doesn't make a lot of sense. But the scene is great because after Annie and Laura drive off, Dr. Loomis comes up and introduces himself to Sheriff Brackett. So we get a medium close-up on them in this wide shot still. And in the periphery, we see Michael Myers' car just drive up and then turn.
Yep.
And it doesn't draw attention to it. It's just in the frame. And it's just, again, it's another thing. What Carpenter does so well is he uses the entire shot. Mm-hmm. He's not wasting it. That space in the side, that's because by putting the killer or the stalker in that space sometimes, what he does is he makes the space important all the time because you realize the killer might be there.
Yep.
So Loomis, he introduces himself to Brackett and he says he needs to talk to Brackett. And I think they cut from here. Do they cut
to more Laurie and Annie driving?
That's
so they pick it up and their dialogue's uninteresting, except
the Ben Tramer part, right?
Yes, and they're worried, or Laurie is worried that Annie's dad, Sheriff Brackett, recognized the fact
odor.
that they had been getting high.
he could smell the odor of the sticky icky from the vehicle, but
he definitely could.
He apparently couldn't, or if he could, he didn't say anything about it. But
I think that there is one point there that is being made is to the extent that we have parents and adults in this film, aside from Loomis, they are incompetent, or at the least, like, kind of utterly uninterested in what the teenagers are doing.
Right. And we'll talk about this a little bit later when we ask, like, why the hell doesn't Brackett even check in on his daughter or let her know?
Right.
But yes, this is something that becomes a staple in slasher films, right? Which is basically you set up a situation in which young people, mostly women, but young people in general, are somehow isolated from adults, isolated from people who could protect them.
Yes.
Often the people who should protect them are miserable, incompetent failures. And there's some sort of tension between the generations, which is interesting because this is explicitly played out in Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street, which is, of course, a staple of the slasher genre, in which the parents actually killed and created the monster, Freddy Krueger, and then they're incompetent and they don't help the kids at all.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
So
So
we get
that
that.
we'll just note that theme, that it becomes the kind of a hallmark of the slasher, is certainly in Halloween, but
Yes.
it's less pronounced.
Right, which is what we basically get with the slasher is that in Halloween, all of the themes, or a lot of them at least, are not so in your face, right?
Right. And then
Um,
these kind of
it,
soft themes are
yes,
crystallized and just
yes,
abused.
right. So, but we also get that Laurie just says she would rather go out with this guy Ben Tramer, who will briefly show up in the second movie only to be killed in a fiery blaze.
Yeah.
But
He doesn't play a part in this movie
no.
except for in the dialogue.
Right, right. So this is also a place where we get weird timing because we have this shot that's at evening, and then the car turns. It's being followed by Myers again, and then the next cut we get is a shot at night, pitch
Yeah,
black.
it's pitch black. Yeah.
Right. So,
We
but
cut from there, we cut to the Myers house again.
yes, yes. So
And
this is my favorite scene in the entire
so,
film.
but yes, but again, keeping with the idea, like when they're doing the cross cutting here, they're really loose with the chronology. So we're supposed to
Yes,
believe that Loomis, right during the day at about 3 o'clock or so, he's talking to Brackett outside the hardware shop. The
yes.
next time we see him is in Myers' house with Brackett. So apparently they took the 3 hours. They were just like, hey, let's peace out and do whatever, and then we'll get
Right,
back together.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
But it shows you like how using the cutting, you don't, like when you're watching it, you don't even think about, oh, they had 3 hours to
Right.
do
What were
all
they
of
doing?
this.
Right.
Right.
It just tells you how sort of inexorable the logic of film is, and you just buy it and you don't
Right.
really think about it. I will say I thought with the cross cutting here, because we basically have two stories. Well, right here we do. We have the high school women and then the Loomis story. I think they do a good job with the pacing of
Yeah.
switching back and forth.
I would agree. And then they end up having cross cutting between three because you have
Yes.
Annie's house,
Right.
Tommy's, and then Loomis.
Right. And then of course the Loomis world and the Laurie world intersect at the end, which
Yes.
is what you want with good cross-cutting, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, they're in the Myers house now, and it's very creepy inside. It's it's basically your stereotypical haunted house, if you will. And what I love, they set this up. There's a dead dog in there,
Yeah.
and Brackett touches the dog and says it's warm, and then Loomis says he got hungry. I guess suggesting that Myers killed and ate the dog
Yes.
without cooking it or anything, I presumably.
Yeah.
And then Brackett is like, a man would never do this. And then Loomis says, this isn't a man.
Yes.
So we get this great, again, building up. This Myers is so psychotic, sadistic, and evil that he just killed a dog and ate part of it, and then left part of it. Now, what I couldn't figure out is, when did Myers kill this dog that it would still be warm?
There's not really he
Right.
didn't have the opportunity, but it's not put there for realism.
Right. So then they go up to the room where Myers killed his sister.
Yeah.
And here we have the second stupid jump scare
Another
that makes
jump,
no
yes.
sense. But Loomis is talking about how Myers could have seen here through the window, I guess, of Judith fooling around with her boyfriend.
Although we know that
suggestion.
actually didn't happen.
Right. It kind of
So it's
weird.
weird.
So yeah, and then this thing falls and breaks the window, startling Loomis. And then Loomis says something to Brackett like, you must think me something.
Well, Loomis takes his gun out
Right,
immediately after
takes
this
his
thing
gun
smashes the window.
Yeah.
One of my favorite little script details is after he puts his gun away and he says some of this dialogue that you were referring to, he says, I have a permit for it. And he like pulls his
he actually
permit
shows
out.
his permit.
Yeah, I found that just
Yes.
remarkable.
Yeah, so he shows he has this permit for this concealed weapon, but he also
Brackett
says
is clearly interested in running the permit.
yeah, so yes. So Loomis says you must think me something, and then Brackett says to him, seems to me that you are just plain scared. And then Loomis says, yes, I am. Right. Which I like this because we get this, Loomis is, you could call him the avenging angel if you want, or he's the kind of, I think the best comparison is Captain Ahab following the white whale. So he's like monomaniacally obsessed with Myers, but he's also scared of him. And he admits as such, and he says, yes, I am. And then here we get, I don't care if this is purple and overwrought dialogue. God damn, is it good. So we get the most important description of Myers that we'll get. Dr. Loomis says he's scared, and then he explains why.
Yes.
And he talks about Myers. I assume, do you have some of this dialogue written down because it's awesome?
I do. He says, I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left. No reason, no conscience, no understanding in even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or evil, right or wrong. I met this 6-year-old child with his blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Right. So
that is the skeleton key to Michael Myers right there.
Right.
That is it.
It is.
That's the dissertation that got Loomis the PhD, right?
Right. That is what proves that Loomis is in fact a deep metaphysician.
Yes.
And understands the metaphysical significance of Myers.
Yes.
And so this is purple prose, of course, but it works. And the reason it works is because, again, Donald Pleasance delivers this with gusto. And I love this. They cut and he's talking, and then he kind of looks up, like as if to say, like, how can you even fathom this person, this metaphysical evil? Also, I think this is why I like the comparison to Captain Ahab, who's obsessed with the whale and Moby Dick, because the whale, the white whale and Moby Dick is just this kind of metaphysical entity, this mysterious intellectual thing, evil, fate, all of this symbolism in it. So this just makes more, Myers is more symbolically resonant because of this kind of a speech.
Yes.
The doctor, I'm sorry, the sheriff will make fun of him later for fancy talk.
Yes, he
which
does.
Is a fair rebuke of Loomis. But anyway, so we get this. So they're in this quote.
But what's also, it's really important here to note that after all of this dialogue, Brackett, so Loomis tells Brackett to tell his men to keep their mouths shut and their eyes open.
Yes.
Right. And Brackett doesn't even think that this is significant enough to warn his daughter about, right?
Right. This is what's perplexing is
instead of calling Annie and saying, hey, it might be a good idea to, be like hide in a bathroom
to head in, or not to babysit tonight, or you shouldn't be alone. Instead of doing that, he does nothing. He doesn't contact his daughter. He doesn't check on his daughter at all. To his credit, he does say, like, I think we should put this on the TV and the radio. And this is where Loomis inexplicably says, no, don't do that. And it's because you can tell they have to set the script up in such a way that these kids are going to be left alone.
Right.
And the sort of logic of human psychology is ignored.
Well, in this case, I think it's particularly problematic in this case because Loomis is the one character who gets it, who's the protector. And in this case, he fucks up
Right. He
He
says
could have
no.
he could have gave the green light and said, yeah, like,
Right.
let's get this stuff out here, protect these kids, man. We got to do it.
Which is, of course, what he would do. But instead, he says, no, if you do that, they'll see him on every corner, as if
Right.
that would be bad, that they
Yeah.
would be hyper vigilant. After Loomis literally thinks pure evil came to this town to slaughter people, but he's like, no, don't do that.
Yeah, just keep it under wraps,
Yeah,
right?
keep your eyes open, but don't broadcast it because everybody will see him then. So
Yeah,
that's a bit perplexing.
one interpretation that I read that I don't really put much into it, but it's that Loomis wanted to have a mano y mano showdown
Yeah.
with Myers,
Okay.
and that's just no. It's just
No.
they needed this to work in a
Right. Let's
certain
just
way.
admit what happened here. The script writers needed the kids to be basically left alone,
Yeah,
and therefore they made that happen despite the fact that it makes little sense.
yeah.
Yes.
So
we,
after this, we cut to the Doyle's house, and there is some interaction between Tommy and Laurie. I think that what's interesting is there's this other brilliant shot of when Tommy looks out the window
yes.
and sees is it the Wallaces, Lindsay
Yeah,
Wallace,
he's looking at the
where
house where Annie's
Annie,
babysitting.
yeah,
Yeah.
and there's some lighting in the front of it, and you see the shadowy figure of Michael Myers against
Right.
the house.
Again, this is like an extreme long shot through the window. You just
Yep.
see this very small figure standing in front of this eerie bluish tinted light on this house, right? Yeah,
Yes.
and then he says, he saw the boogeyman out there.
Yeah, and
Laurie's
Laurie says there
on the
is no
phone,
boogeyman.
right? And she's very dismissive. This is another thing that perplexes me because Laurie's been seeing this person all day and was herself clearly disconcerted by it. But now that Tommy's saying he's seeing somebody, she's utterly dismissive.
Yes.
So that's a bit perplexing. But so she's talking to Annie. Annie says that Ben Tramer got really excited about the idea of taking Laurie to the dance.
Mm-hmm.
Some stuff goes on. We don't need to go into all of that into intense detail, but at some point we see Myers now is like looking in at Annie as I think she's on the phone and she's making popcorn.
Yeah.
And then we have this ridiculous scene in which she basically spills about a half cup of what is obviously water on herself and says, oh shit, like I just spilled all of this butter on me, hangs up the phone, and then
strips to her underwear.
Right. So this is where we get some of this kind of exploitation flick, teenage sex stuff. And of course, everybody except for Laurie is incredibly libidinous, as people are in high school. But we have some exploitation type scenery here, and Annie strips down. And, we saw it again. All of this is it's so effective because Myers is just somewhere watching, right? He's just standing somewhere in this gorgeously lit scene through the window, through the curtains or whatever, watching. And
then we'll also note, so we have, when we're thinking about the body count of Michael Myers,
yes,
we noted that he killed and ate or partially ate a dog.
Yes.
In this one of these scenes around here, he has his second canine victim.
He kills another dog.
Yeah, the Wallace's dog Lester.
Yes.
Andy lets Lester out, and we have this shot of Michael Myers choking him out, and then Lester dies.
Right, and what's amazing about this is Myers' kill count in 78, disregarding Judith,
yes,
his kill count is remarkably small. He killed a truck driver, he killed Bob, Linda, and Andy. So he killed 4 people. He killed 2 dogs, though.
Yes, he has two men or two males, two females, and two dogs.
And two dogs. And
Yes.
and why this is interesting is because the kill count, of course, in subsequent slasher films had to get higher and higher.
Yes.
Because if in this film it takes like an hour to get into the real killing that we see, and other than the original kill, of course. And in the David Gordon Green 2018 Halloween, which is supposed to take off, just the only one in the series that actually happened was this one, the 78 one. They talk about Myers as if it's some amazing serial killer. And they do this in H2O too, but it's like, he only killed 4 people. So it's the way they talk about him is as if he slaughtered like 50 people. And it would make sense if Halloween 1, 2, 3, 4, well, 3, you can 3, not,
Yeah,
never
throw
mind,
out
but
3.
yeah, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. If those had happened, it would make sense. But with this one, it doesn't make a lot of sense anyway. So the kill count is actually quite low.
Yeah, and so I think, long story short, essentially what happens is that Annie wants to go see her boyfriend Paul El Jerko, who found a way out of being grounded. We're not told what it is, but he did.
Yes.
And in order to do this, she has to have the girl she's babysitting for, Lindsay Wallace. She wants to take Lindsay over to the Doyles so that Laurie will be babysitting both Lindsay and Tommy.
Yes.
So that Andy can go get Paul.
Yes. And this is where we get, so Annie goes and drops off Lindsay with Laurie. Laurie says, basically Annie says, I'll think about calling Tramer and telling him, like, I don't know, it's off or whatever, if you watch Lindsay. Laurie's down with that. Annie goes back home. There's this silly scene in which she gets stuck in a window.
Yes. It's just a scene to have basically her backside exposed to the camera.
Right. But what I will say is there is this wonderful shot of Myers in the window behind her. And in fact, there's another shot where you're outside of a window, you see Annie in there, and then in the back window past that, you see Myers. So it's 2 windows, Myers is back there, lit in a very tasteful way, creepy, you can't really see him. And again, so he's got this, what was a Captain Kirk mask, again, painted white, etc., but you don't really see the mask. And this is a great decision that Carpenter made, that later movies would ignore this lesson, which is you don't put the killer, you don't do a close-up on the killer's face. You have him off in the corner. You don't even show his face sometimes. You have him behind something, so you can't really see what he is, what he looks like.
Yes, yeah, I agreed. So after this, we cut back to Loomis at the Myers house.
Is that before Annie's dead?
No, Annie dies first.
So this kill is, it's not particularly,
it's not impressive at all. So,
but she goes
she goes to the car.
She noticed the car's locked, so she's like, oh, I have to get my keys. She goes back, gets her keys.
But just as a note, she wouldn't need the keys if the car wasn't locked.
Right. Doesn't make sense because you got to turn the ignition.
Right.
But so she forgot her keys. She comes back to the car and opens the door without putting the key in. I think the idea here is Carpenter wants us to know that something happened here that Annie doesn't know because she's not paying attention.
Yeah.
So we as the audience know, wait a second, the door was locked before. Annie gets in and the car is all fogged up, which raises questions that we don't want to go into about what Myers was doing in the vehicle. But Annie's like, it's foggy in here. And then Myers starts choking her and then slits her throat bloodlessly. I will say the actress, Nancy Loomis or Keys, does a very peculiar rendition of death.
Yes.
Her choice here is peculiar.
Probably Carpenter's choice, I would
Carpenter's
imagine.
choice is it's an interesting death phase.
It's a very underwhelming
yes
death scene.
Yes.
And it is interesting though that it's bloodless, because
yes
if anybody had any thought that Halloween's like this gory movie, this demonstrates clearly no, it's not.
Yeah, this is what Friday the 13th would have been like. We're gonna have, pustulating wounds and spraying blood if we get the carotid. Like no way we're letting that go without blood. But in Halloween, you see almost no blood. So Annie's dead. We cut back to Loomis or to Myers' house again, which I like. I love this scene because we have Loomis standing outside behind like these bushes, I guess. And at this point, Lonnie, the kid, and a couple of his friends are talking about the house. And I guess Lonnie's idea is, I'm going to go in there.
Yeah.
And Loomis does this thing where he's like, hey, Lonnie, get your ass away from there. And Lonnie runs off scared. And then Loomis gives just the best reaction. He looks so smug and self-satisfied that he has scared this kid.
Yes, he managed to scare a fifth grader.
Sixth grader. Yeah. So he's very proud of himself. And then actually I forget. So there's another jump scare here.
Yeah. So Brackett bumps into him and scares Loomis.
Right. And then Brackett's basically like, I don't see shit going on.
Yes,
and then I don't think anything's going on. And Loomis, or he's like, then you're under the wrong impression.
Yeah, you have the wrong feeling. And then Brackett says, you're not doing very much to prove me wrong. And then this dialogue is kind of stilted. It's not as good as the first dialogue between Loomis and Brackett. Because Loomis says, what more do you need? Like, dude, nothing has happened. What do you mean?
Well, no, I disagree with that. They found a dead dog in the Myers house that was warm.
That's true, but Brackett was there with him.
Yeah, I know, but that means something has happened. What more would you need? That you have this place that's been robbed, and the Myers house, the house in which this happened, there was a dead dog in it that was warm. So somebody just did it.
Fair enough. So
Brackett, I guess he says a skunk could have done it.
Yeah, yes. Brackett says, it's going to take more than fancy talk to keep me here.
Right.
And then Loomis has a line about, I watched him for 15 years, staring at a wall, looking at past the wall, looking at this night, inhumanly patient, waiting for some secret silent alarm to trigger him off. Death has come to your little town, sheriff.
Yeah, I like this dialogue still.
Yeah.
Again, Loomis is, he's giving this pretentious metaphysical interpretation to Myers. And also,
it's becoming more concrete too. It's not just Myers is metaphysical evil. It's specifically about this night.
Yeah, apparently he was waiting, looking through this wall, and and this is a poetic line, he's waiting for some secret silent alarm to trigger him off. So apparently the silent alarm triggered him off. And then Brackett says, you're telling me all these people are here in line for a slaughter or whatever. And then Loomis says they might be. Now, Brackett, one thing finally they have somebody do something right. Brackett basically says, in the off chance that you're right, I'm gonna help you out. I'm gonna look. But then he says, and this is perplexing, inexplicable even, he's like, if you are right about this, like, why, damn you for letting him go.
Right.
Which is really weird because Loomis has been telling him, I tried everything I could to keep him locked up.
Yes.
So it's weird. And in fact,
entirely unclear why it would be Loomis's fault that this is happening.
Yes. And then in the second film, they have the scene where, Brackett finds out that his daughter is dead, and he says to Loomis, God damn you, as if it were Loomis's fault, which it makes no sense. But anyway, whatever. So Brackett at least does the right thing, and that he's like, okay, he does one right thing. And the off chance that you're right, I'm going to look around. What he doesn't do It's check in on his daughter.
No, he's
Which makes no
still
sense.
doesn't even use the phone to call her,
Right.
because that would take too much effort.
Makes no sense. But then we get the stupidest characters come back, at least in my view. Bob and Linda.
Bob and Linda show up to the Wallaces where Annie was babysitting,
right,
in a van.
and this is one of the more disturbing lines that people don't talk about much. So Linda's this party totally cheerleader who just laughs all the time. And Bob is this very libidinous 17, 18-year-old boyfriend or whatever. And they're drinking beers in the van and they're like, what are we going to do? And then Bob's like, I think I have the plan. First, I'm going to take your clothes off. Then I'm going to take my clothes off. And then he says, then we're going to take Lindsay's clothes off. Lindsay is a 10 or 11-year-old girl. So it's very weird that this dialogue is in there. They don't say anything about it again. I don't know what it is, but I would have to think in the era of Me Too, this kind of dialogue would be very frowned upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that he's such this idiotic, libidinous teenager that's the only thing
that he's going to have
about.
a menage a trois with an 11-year-old included.
So
anyway, it doesn't really make sense.
But they go in the house and they find out that Annie's not going to be back.
Right, but here's another thing that doesn't make sense. No, they find out that Linda calls Laurie, and Laurie says that she's got Lindsay and Annie. Why isn't Annie there? She probably stopped off somewhere with Paul. Just have her call me. And then Lindsay says to Bob.
You mean Linda?
Yeah, too many L names. Linda says to Bob, like, hey, Lindsay's not going to be back tonight. And they act as though, that means the house is free. Now, remember, this isn't even their house. It's not even Annie's house. It's the house Annie is babysitting for.
Right.
So they're like, great, that means we can go off and have sex in the bedroom.
Yes. So they proceed to, this then leads to, I think, some of the worst scenes in the film.
Well, okay, but let's before getting into that, there was a scene before this in which Tommy, I think it was before this, in which Tommy looks out. So at one time, Tommy Doyle, the young child being babysitted, looked out and he saw Myers just standing there. He looked out another time and he saw Myers carrying Annie's dead body into the house and freaked out again.
He freaks out again. Laurie is dismissive, but this time now Lindsay, who Annie was babysitting, is there, and Lindsay says to Tommy, I believe you.
No, that comes a little bit later when Tommy's because Tommy is trying to scare Lindsay.
Right. Yeah.
And then he looks out and he gets scared himself. And then he says, nobody believes me that I've seen the boogeyman. And then Lindsay says, I believe you.
Yes. That's right. So then we have these scenes at the Wallace's house where Annie was babysitting, where Linda and Paul are now there. So
Linda and Bob.
I'm sorry,
Paul
Linda.
Annie's.
Yeah, Linda and Bob, where they're now in the bedroom.
They have some of the most awkward, bizarre sex that you'll ever see on.
they do, but also interesting for the mise-en-scène there.
Yes.
While they're in the bed, there's a lit jack-o'-lantern.
Right.
On the side of the bed, which we don't know what happened, why it's there, who put it there, how long it's been there. Yes. We also see Michael Myers' shadow on the wall. So we know he's lurking while they're doing this. So they finish and Linda says, oh, fantastic, and sends Bob down to get some brewskis.
Right. Now, importantly, this is where one of the so-called slasher rules comes from, because Bob says, I'll be right back.
He specifically says, I'll be right back, don't get dressed.
Yeah,
he's ready for another round, but first they got to rejuvenate
round
with
one
some
was
brewskis.
So impressive that he's in for round two, but now with brewskis. And again, this isn't even Annie's house. This is the house Annie's babysitting for, and he's just like, I'm going to make myself at home. use their bedroom, and then go grab some brews from the fridge.
Yeah. So he goes down to grab a couple of beers, looks out and notices that the door is open.
Yes.
And we get some heavy breathing also. So as the viewer, we strongly suspect Myers is somewhere nearby, right?
Yes.
So he goes, he closes the door, turns toward the sound of the breathing eventually, and Myers busts through, stabs him in the stomach up against a couple of doors.
Yes.
Now, again, the death scenes are incredibly underwhelming in terms of like how they're acted. And here, Bob is stabbed through the stomach and dies instantaneously.
Well, he's like getting choked against the wall, and then we hear the thrust of the stab as he's impaled to the wall.
Yes, and then he's dead.
We get and he's almost immediately dead. And then we get this physics-defying scene, which is cool, so I don't care.
Yeah,
but
it's nice looking.
Right, so he's been impaled to a wall with a knife, and he hangs to the wall vertically from this knife in his, I guess, upper stomach, which of course he would just fall right off. No knife would ever hold somebody up like that. But we do get this, it's the lighting again, it's this eerie bluish tint with great shadows, and we get this scene, a two shot where Myers is looking at Bob's body. And this is according to who was the actor who played Myers?
Nick Castle.
Yeah, Nick Castle. According to Castle, Carpenter didn't give a lot of direction to him, but on this scene he did. And he has Castle look up at the dead body and tilt his head from side to side as if appreciating or being sort of
mystified
and impressed by his own work. And it's just a great touch to this character.
Yes. So after Bob is killed, Laurie decides
No. Then we get the stupid scene that I would like to call.
Oh, I'm sorry. I erased it from my mind.
Yes, and I would like to erase it from the film. So what we get is Linda's in bed, and a person with a white sheet and eyes cut, so like a Casper the Ghost costume with Bob's glasses over the top, comes in the door.
Yes.
And Linda's trying to talk, like, oh, where are my beers? Whatever, are you going to talk? And Bob doesn't say anything. And Linda says, what's the matter? Can I get your ghost? And laughs about it. And it's really stupid. And then
it's
Linda,
obnoxious.
Right. And then Linda, instead of saying like, okay, like, let's talk or whatever, she's like, well, this is going nowhere. I'm going to call Laurie.
Yep.
So she calls Laurie. And then this is sticking with these phone calls again. We find out that, no, this wasn't Bob. Of course, we knew that. This is Michael Myers under a sheet, starts choking Linda. So just as Laurie answers the phone, we hear Linda choking. And Laurie's like, okay, first I got chewing and now I get your squealing or whatever. Mm-hmm. But then she kind of she's like, wait a second, like, Linda, are you okay? Myers chokes her, I think, with the phone cord.
It's with the phone cord. She chokes out.
Right, she chokes out. But we do get one awesome shot here. So Linda's dead, and Laurie's talking in the phone. And then importantly, this is the first shot in which we see Michael's face straight on. Yep. We see the mask, which is awesome looking. And it's this tint of blue, eerie face. And he sort of like holds the phone up as if kind of perplexed by it.
Yes.
And that's the first contact, like real, somehow like this connection between the shape or Myers and Laurie. So it's a great shot. And Laurie's now disturbed by what she heard on the phone. So as you were saying,
she then decides that she's going to go over to check in on Annie, or I guess at this point it would be Linda and Bob, right?
Right.
she's just gonna check on the Wallace's house to see what's happening there.
Yeah, like what's going on there.
Right. So she eventually walks in, and I think everything seems kind of normal initially, right?
Yeah, but nobody's there.
Nobody's there.
So she can't see anybody, and then she walks up the stairs, and then we see a room with the light on, and the doors, I think, creaked open. And she walks in, and we see it from her reaction. She starts getting really scared.
Yeah.
Now, this shot is weird because usually what you would do if you cut away from that is you would cut from her, you would have the person's reaction. And then what we expect to happen is that you cut and show us their point of view. But actually, Carpenter doesn't do that. He cuts away from that, and then he actually the camera moves up so that it's a reveal of what it is. And it's a reveal of Annie sprawled supine on the bed with Judith Meyer's cemetery stone and a bunch of candles. So Myers,
not candles, the jack-o'-lantern.
Oh, the jack-o'-lantern. Yeah. So Myers is a bit of an artist too.
Yes.
He stole the cemetery stone so he could create this recreation,
memorial to Judith or something. Right. We don't really know what's
unclear.
Happening.
But at this point, this is where I think either the direction or Jamie Lee Curtis is young, because she became a very good actor, and she's decent in this. She's better than most people in the film, but her acting or the direction sort of lets her down. So she's, she just seen one of her best friends is dead. She starts making weird noises and kind of walking back, and then Bob's body somehow swings out of the closet. Yes. So apparently Myers had created this scene with Annie, put Bob's body somehow, he
upside down,
hung the body upside down, and then Laurie stumbles into another room.
No, she stumbles. It's right next to where Bob's body is.
Oh, that's where the door opens.
The door opens, and it's Linda crammed in like a right. like a shelf or something.
Right. So
in
now,
this closet.
And this is a trope that will occur, or a kind of scene that will occur in most subsequent slasher films.
That is, the final girl. All of the bodies are revealed to her.
She discovers all of the bodies somehow inexplicably in one room.
Yes.
But so she does this, and she's kind of stumbling around. The acting's not particularly good, or I don't know what's going on here, but
there is a great shot.
And this is where you just have to give Dean Cundey props. And he returned for the second movie, and it shows, because the second movie looks really good too, unlike the other ones. So Laurie's next to this pitch black closet, and we just shoot with her, and we see the closet, and then slowly, as if materializing from nothingness, we see Myers' face lighting up, the mask.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful shot.
It's a brilliant shot. Unfortunately, what comes next is a little
stilted.
Ridiculous.
It's kind of stilted, right? Because we see he tries to stab. Yeah.
He tries to stab at her, inexplicably misses.
Right.
She falls over the rail of the stairs. So from the second story to the floor level, but is not really hurt. Like, she's a bit gimpy after that. But other than that, the 10-foot drop had no effect on her.
Right. So Myers has I mean, this is like a free throw for Steph Curry. It should be, but he somehow misses completely. Well, no, he doesn't. He nicks her on the shoulder, I guess.
He doesn't.
Yeah. And then Carpenter's, the action here leaves a bit wanting. I mean, it's just like a cut from, it's clearly a cut from, like, Curtis was standing, and then she was standing, or kind of plopped down on the stairs. It's just a cut with a sound effect.
And the other thing that Carpenter does in a couple of these scenes here that I don't like is he abuses perspective to make you feel like Myers is closer than he is to
You know
Laurie.
what? I like that. I don't even
Okay.
care. You're right. He abuses perspective in that, like, so this is how the chase works, right? You're
Yeah.
saying is that you get these cuts from Laurie to Myers chasing her, and
Who's clearly closer to her, right?
right. I mean, it's building suspense in a way that is implausible because, like, in real life, he would just grab her immediately. Right.
Right. You're taking advantage of you're doing cuts from
Right.
one cut to another,
Yeah,
like
but
these
I
reverse
like it.
shots.
It's as long as it's not too preposterous that it takes me out of it. Maybe it took you out of it. It doesn't with me. So I find it suspenseful and effective. So we get this. Laurie's getting chased by Myers, and
Yes.
there are some weird things like she's running out and Myers had managed to prop a rake against a door and
Yes.
it's unclear when he did this, but this is good suspense. So she's stuck in this room. Myers breaks through the door and comes in, and then finally she smacks her hand through the window, moves the rake, gets out the door,
Starts, yeah, now she's
starts
out in the
screaming.
open, starts screaming, and goes to a house that's not the
Yes.
Doyle's residence and is screaming, "Oh God, please help me," knocks on the door. They turn the lights on
Yes.
briefly, but then
Yes.
ignore her. So that kind of
Yes.
plays to the theme of adults, impotent adults just
Yeah.
leaving these kids to their fate.
Right. And I think this is interesting because I heard an interview with Carpenter where he was telling how horrified he was by the story of Kitty Genovese, who
Mm.
was this woman who was killed. I believe it was in New York. I mean, the
Yeah, it was in
stories,
Kew Gardens.
yeah. So she was, the story is, let's just say, that she was screaming while she was being attacked, and so many people heard her and did nothing about it. And I think whether that's true or not is irrelevant for this because Carpenter heard that story. And I think that's sort of playing here is that this
Yeah.
woman's getting chased and screaming, and they just turn off the lights and are like, whatever. Then we have one of the great scenes in the film, in my view. Maybe you would argue against this, but it was copied many times in these kinds of films where you build up this suspense where Laurie runs and realizes she doesn't have the keys to her door,
Hmm.
and Myers is coming from the house walking across the street, and we keep cutting to him and he's getting closer and she's yelling, and she had thrown a pot up to wake up Tommy. He's leisurely walking down because of course he doesn't know the danger, and she's freaking out. This is well done suspense, and then finally Tommy opens the door and she gets in.
Yep. And then when she gets into the Doyle house, then at some point, Loomis sees the station wagon
Right.
and realizes that Myers is in fact there, not just in Haddonfield, but right in that little neighborhood
Right.
there.
But
He goes
let's know
running.
how implausible this is. So apparently Loomis was at the Myers house for hours, never noticed that Myers' vehicle was just parked across the street.
Yes.
But finally he sees it and he's like, oh shit, like he's back in this area, and he goes off to look for Myers.
Yes. And he bumps into Brackett,
Yes.
tells Brackett, "You take like this spot, I'll
Right.
run out in front of the houses or something."
Right. And so,
Um,
yes.
so and then inside the Doyle home, so Myers gets uh, Laurie gets inside and notices that there was a window that's open or was broken, right?
Right, which is weird because it didn't that wasn't the case earlier. It's
Also, the
unclear.
phone is caught.
The phone is caught. Right. It's unclear if Myers opened that window and got in somehow. If that, I mean, because she just comes in, tells the kids to go upstairs and sits on the couch, and Myers is in there. So somehow he got in. I guess it's suggested that it was through the window, right?
Yes, and so I mean, I think we can condense this and just say there's some fighting between
Yes.
Laurie and Myers.
Yes. It's now again, all of this is like well shot. The colors are interesting. We have this blue and orange contrast, these primary colors. It looks quite good. The action is a bit off, but
Yes.
whatever. So yeah, he gets poked by a sewing needle
And the
and falls
neck.
down. Yes. And Laurie, instead of taking the knife and stabbing this dude a few times, just drops it and goes upstairs.
Yeah, she goes upstairs, hugs Lindsay and Tommy, and says, I killed the boogeyman, basically. Tommy
Right.
says, you can't kill the boogeyman, and
Right.
then sees that Michael is walking toward them. He has come up the stairs and turned the corner, and he's ready to engage in some more carnage.
Right. And we get the theme of this is the boogeyman. You can't kill this force of evil. And so yeah, she tells them to lock the door. She goes in. Here's another iconic scene. She goes into the room and goes into a closet and ties like a little something, a string around the closet to try to lock it. Myers has a preternatural sense of where his victims are, or where his
Yes.
potential victims are. So he immediately goes to the closet, breaks through it, and we get this shot where he's like grabbing at stuff and he turns on the light. It's a
Yeah.
great shot, turns on the light and then turns it back off. Meanwhile, Laurie had taken a wire hanger and unspooled it or unwinded it and then stabs him in the eye.
And then
And,
thrusts,
yes.
does a couple of knife thrusts this time, and he
Right.
drops
Yeah.
dead,
Yes.
or seemingly dead.
Right. So this time she did stab him with a knife. Presumably he's dead. He falls down. She goes and tells the Lindsay Wallace and Tommy Doyle to go down to the Mackenzies and call the police.
Yes, and sends them, and they leave the house and they start yelling. And then there's the other just phenomenal shot where Laurie has rested her head on the side of the doorway into this room, and we see in the shot, like behind her, Myers is laying on the ground, seemingly
Yes.
dead, and then he just slowly pops up.
Right.
It's this perfect, like, it's one of those shots where the way he moves, like you couldn't replicate that, like the kind of feel of that shot. Right, it's
Right.
just an interesting movement of his body.
It's a very inhuman movement. And I'm sure
Yes.
Carpenter said, like, if you can get up like this is the way to do it, where it just looks abnormal. It's not the way a human would get up from the ground.
Right. So Myers,
Also, it
yeah,
illustrates again the full use of the shot, because
yes,
this is in the background. So we
yeah,
see Laurie in the foreground. In the background, we see Myers, and we see Myers getting up. So we know he's getting up, but we know that Laurie doesn't know. So
right.
that adds this tension because Laurie's sitting there and Myers is slowly walking toward her.
So then the kind of penultimate and ultimate scenes are this cross-cutting action coming together, because Loomis hears the kids screaming and he knows now where Myers is. So he
Right.
goes into the house. Laurie does more some battle with Myers. And this, I think this was a mistake. So this scene with Loomis coming into the house and upstairs, we have Laurie fighting with Michael, and she pulls his mask off
Yes.
and reveals his face, and he just looks like a normal young dude. There's nothing, it's relatively
Kind of like a normal
nondescript.
dude with a messed up eye,
Yeah, he
presumably
has the,
because he got poked in it.
yeah.
But
Other than that, it's just kind of this normal looking face.
yeah, and I agree. There's no reason to show his face. It doesn't. It actually sort of subtracts from what Carpenter had been doing the whole time by making him this sort of metaphysical force, and it turns him into a human for a brief moment. And
Yeah.
I don't understand it either.
So Loomis comes in, points the gun at him, as his mask is off and in his hand, and then shoots him.
Well, he's pulling it. He pulls his mask back on and gets shot. Now,
Yes.
what I thought about this is Loomis doesn't say, stop. What are you doing? You know, cut it out. I'll shoot you. He just shoots him.
Yeah. Well, Loomis knows he's pure evil.
Yeah. So Loomis goes and just puts six shots into him.
Put 6 rounds into Myers, who then goes flying off of the balcony.
Yeah, and this is not how shooting things work. So apparently in the world of Halloween, when you get shot, you fall back like 3 feet and then you fall back again with each bullet until finally you fly out of a window.
So he flies out and he hits the ground. We see him. So he's fallen out of the 2nd-story window.
Yes.
Apparently dead onto the ground. And then we have this brilliantly acted shot where Loomis looks out the window down below to what has become of Michael.
Yes.
Right. And we see Michael is gone. Right. So the body's no longer there. And Loomis obviously, or Pleasance, had the choice of, well, you could play this like you're surprised. You could play this like that's exactly what you expected to happen. And he plays it almost ambiguously, right? Where you could interpret in any number of ways. Like, he doesn't look like he's terribly surprised, but there might be a little bit of ambivalence. Like, he had hoped maybe Myers was really dead.
Well, I wouldn't say ambivalence, and I'd say there's ambiguous. It's
ambiguous.
Certainly he hoped he was dead. I think you're right, though. It is brilliant acting. And I think Carpenter said, or I think Pleasance asked Carpenter,
right,
how do you want me to play this? I could do it this way or that way or whatever. And Carpenter basically let him do what he wanted. And I think you're right. What he does is he gives at first it's a little bit of a look of surprised horror, not much of one, but a little bit. Like, you get the sense he's like, oh shit, he is gone. And then you get this kind of resigned, I knew it. And then he looks out, and this is great because he just looks as if to say to the audience, he's still out there somewhere.
Right. And then
we get it. I think before this scene, though, we got the scene where Jamie says, was that the boogeyman? And he says, this is a great line. So she says, was that the boogeyman? And he says, as a matter of fact, it was.
Yeah.
Donald Pleasance is a great delivery. And if you want to see what can happen when you take these lines or concepts and you have less quality directing and acting, watch Rob Zombie's remake of this, because Malcolm McDowell, who's actually a good actor, plays Dr. Loomis and gives basically the same, that has the same lines here. And it's awful. It's just terrible. And in fact, he has another one where he tries to give this, the typical disquisition about how Myers is pure evil. And that is also terrible. So Carpenter managed with Pleasance to create this feeling of gravity and sincerity to this that doesn't turn into camp. And I like that. But that also, so when we get this shot of Loomis looking out, then we get a great montage, right, of all of the places in the film, and we hear Myers breathing in the background, as if to say he's still out there somewhere. We don't know where he is. He's not here. He's out there, and that's that.
Yeah. So the montage shot then concludes the movie, and as you noted, we hear the breathing, so we know he's out there.
Right.
And that is a wrap for the film.
Yeah. So the great thing about this ending is that it retains the mystery of Myers. So this is a person who's now been stabbed in the eye, stabbed with a sewing needle, and shot 6 times, and he's still alive apparently, and he's gone somewhere and he's out there.
Yes. So do you want to rate the film and then?
Yes. Then we
Okay.
can go over some of the things that make it great, and then some of the weaknesses perhaps, and some of the interpretation. So what I would say is, I've seen the film so many times, it's really hard for me to view it like a sort of neutral observer, but it's a legit masterpiece. I'll give it a 9. I'll give it a 9.5 out of 10. I mean, there aren't many better films that have been made in the history of cinema. It's so influential for a reason. I mean, it sets all these tropes in motion, or at least cements them. And it is really just technically well made. It's beautiful to look at. The tension works well. There are many shots that you could just frame and put on the wall. Donald Pleasance gives a great performance. The Loomis character is interesting. There's metaphysical ambiguity and something for the cerebral among audiences to dig into, if they're not just satisfied by the tension and the consummate filmmaking. And I think that's what makes this a little bit more rewarding than Texas Chainsaw, even though that's a great film as well. The only thing that there are two things that, besides some of the, why would this happen, or the time's off or whatever, the two things that detract from the film, I think, seriously at least, are the acting,
Mm-hmm.
which is not surprising given that they got relatively anonymous or no name actors and actresses, and the dialogue. Deborah Hill's dialogue. I mean, I don't want to lay this on Deborah Hill. I feel bad criticizing her part of the film, but I do think the dialogue it's just kind of annoying. It doesn't seem terribly realistic to me. It's not very funny. So I don't like that.
Yeah, I would agree with the 9.5. It's an undisputed masterpiece. It is of the like prototypical or classical slasher films. It is by far the best of them.
Yes.
I don't even think any other slasher comes particularly close.
Agree.
And so I would recommend, like, people should watch this film and then watch a few other generally well-regarded or relatively well-regarded slashers, just to kind of notice the difference in quality. And
Yes.
again, this is this fortuitous Carpenter got complete control of the film. And that's why we have a brilliant slasher instead of a mess or
Right.
just some cliche ridden.
Yeah, instead of just a hackneyed, straight exploitation film, we have a real artistic masterpiece, because Carpenter was a very gifted artist. And I mean,
Yes.
Although his career somewhat inexplicably decayed quite quickly, his talent,
Yeah.
something about it just he was not able to make good films really into the late 80s or 90s. He is clearly a genius, and if anybody challenges that claim, I would point them to this film and The Thing.
Yes.
Two just excellently directed films. So yeah, I agree with that. I agree that it's fortuitous that Carpenter, Carpenter took this film, he took control of it. He said, I'm not doing it unless I get complete control. And
right.
We as the audience are lucky for that. And I agree also that it's worth watching this and then watching a few other slasher films to see, what does Halloween do that other slasher films don't do, and why does Halloween hold up? And it's a timeless piece of art, whereas these other ones are just completely disposable.
I do think that the one criticism that Kale had, that it's not entirely fair, but I can see it, is this kind of criticism that this is a very like a film school type film, right?
Yes.
It is. There are some clear ripoffs in it.
Mhm.
Uh, it it does have the feel of like a film school project by really talented people. The horror film that comes the closest to this, I think, it in modern times in the last decade was It Follows, has that right kind of
Yes.
art
Yes.
school film feel to it.
Yeah, and It Follows is very influenced by Carpenter quite
Right.
clearly. So
Yeah. So
it,
there's a like when you watch this film, you sense a lot of creative energy and ambition from the writers and the director, that they were very hungry to do something interesting with this,
right.
and it just came together perfectly.
Yes.
Um, and unfortunately, because I'm kind of a fan of at least the idea of the slasher, unfortunately, this just never came together in the same way with any of the other slasher films.
Yeah, so this didn't necessarily create all of these tropes of the slasher, right?
But
But it
it put
did,
them together.
yes, it put them together. And
And
so it has,
importantly, it demonstrated that this was a lucrative genre that one
yes,
could play with.
that's
So
right.
immediately after Halloween, we have a spate of cheap, poorly done slashers such as Blood Rage, The Driller Killer, Silent Scream, 1980s The Boogeyman. Christmas Evil is my favorite. So Christmas Evil, this 1980s slasher, is literally about an individual who was mentally traumatized as a child after he found out that Santa Claus was not real. And he works in a toy factory and has a mental breakdown and starts killing people.
Love it.
So then we have like Prom Night, New Year's Evil, Motel Hell, Mother's Day, Terror Train. And of these early classical slashers, Friday the 13th from 1981 is the best of them, I think.
Yeah, and it's the one that stands out because it became such a lucrative franchise. And also, it should be noted the script writer, the director was Sean Cunningham. The script writer clearly and self confessedly um, borrowed quite heavily from Halloween. And so Friday the 13th is very it's in debt to Halloween.
So what do we think about the criticism that I think is might be more accurate of the ripoff slashers than of Halloween, but this criticism that it's actually a socially conservative film where what we have are transgressive youths who are punished, and the proof of that is the one teenager who's sexually repressed is successful. I mean, lives and does not
Right. So
meet
in this case, it would be
deadly
like
fate.
Laurie's the sort of sexually repressed, prudish one, and she survives. And this is a trope that
Other,
plays
yeah,
over and over in other slasher films. We get in Nightmare on Elm Street, for example, we get Nancy, who is the final girl in Friday the 13th. We get final girls in many of the iterations. And yeah, so the criticism is actually this depicts this sort of conservative sensibility in which people are punished
yeah.
for their lustful behaviors. And in fact, the scriptwriter for Friday the 13th said I think he came from a Catholic background, and that kind of resonated with him, and he took it. And also Scream, which lays out the explicit Scream, which is this sort of meta film that criticizes, in some sense, in a humorous way, the slasher genre. Says, you have to be, if you have sex, you're dead.
Yeah. So the Carol Clover is the scholar most famous for this gendered analysis, and she notes that if you watch all of these classical slashers, right,
Mhm.
they portray almost to a cue, middle class kind of conservative society. These teenagers are delinquent, right? They do drugs, have unsafe sex, smoke and drink. And the killer represents like kind of otherness as a way for the community to enforce its conservative moral order. But what's interesting is that the older community in these films does nothing to protect its teens. And so the killer slashes and kills them without any adult obstacles.
Right. So let's go. Yes. Okay. So that's that strikes me as one of those kinds of forced readings that academics like to do with films to make them more intellectually interesting than they probably are. I
Yes.
think so. So let's just focus on Halloween for a moment. And it is true, of course, that Laurie is more sexually repressed, you could say, than the other characters. But really, the thing that Laurie has going for her that saves her life is that she's attentive to her surroundings, and she realizes that there's this person stalking them early on and is not dismissive or oblivious to it.
Right. And I
And
think it's important that she's not a complete conservative prude.
no,
She
she hits a
smokes the ganja with Annie.
right.
She likes boys. She's not like sexually repressed. She wants to have a date. She just
Well,
feels insecure about it.
She's lonely, and
Yeah.
they Annie even mocks her for like having a fortune saved up from babysitting with nothing to do. And I don't think the reading about sexuality in this film is too creative or clever, because it is the case that Myers kills his sister
Mhm.
immediately after she has sex, and kills Bob and Linda immediately after they have sex, and kills Annie right before she's going to have sex.
Yeah. I
So
mean, I
it's not,
think,
that's not like, that's not something that these people are pulling out of thin air. There's something interesting about the fact that there's a relation between Myers' vengeance, you could say, and some sort of sexual behavior that you could argue is threatening to him, or he represents some sort of normal patriarchy or something. I don't think Carpenter intended that, but I think you can
no.
read that. And then here's a question. So this is always an interesting question, which is, does it matter what the auteur or the author intended? Right? Do we care if Carpenter says, I was just trying to make like realistic teenagers, and it just happened to be the case that some of them had healthy expressed libidos and Laurie didn't, but I didn't think anything about that. Are we bound by his claims, or can we say, well, you know what? Whatever you may think about it, the film depicts this, and it's a consistent and coherent interpretation of what's happening.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that trope congealed into this kind of hard rule that was in your face in the later slashers. So people tend to read that back into Halloween, right?
Yes.
And it
Yeah.
gets blamed for starting the final girl trope. And
Which is unfair, because in fact, again, Chainsaw Massacre had the final girl who gets away in the truck.
right.
So it's not clear even that this started that. Although
Well, but in
again,
Chainsaw Massacre, the final girl isn't like this virgin figure.
oh, correct. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
No, that's true. So I guess what I would say is, I think that the author's intentions or stated intentions can be informative, but are not. They don't determine how you should read the
Yeah, I
film.
don't think they should be the final arbiter of the reading. I
Right.
think
So
there's a clear, coherent reading about uh, sexual
yes.
behavior.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think so too.
Especially among girls.
Yeah,
I mean,
female
Bob gets
sexuality.
right because I mean it is true that Bob gets killed, but the boyfriend who had sex with Judith Myers was let go
Yes,
by Michael.
he was let go, and
Right. So
Judith
there,
Myers,
yeah, there's a
yeah.
particular concern with female sexual transgression. I think that's fair.
Yes, and clearly, like I would say in the other horror films, the Friday the 13th, for example, films, and Sleepaway Camp, for example, which actually does some weird things. I mean, it's a poorly made film, but has like a
Bizarre.
weird twist
Yeah.
in it, which I won't give away. It's not an intellectually interesting theme in the way it might be in Halloween, because Halloween is a much more intellectually motivated film. Whereas, you know, you have this trope, but the filmmaker could give a shit about the trope. There's nothing about it is really like played up or interesting inside the actual world of the film. It's just, we want to get teenagers so people will pay money to watch them, and then we're going to kill them.
Right.
And what happened to the slasher film, which Halloween does not do. So Halloween is a good example of a slasher film, a slasher done right. And the problem with the slasher genre is chiefly that our sympathies move from the main characters who are trying to get away from the killer to the killer. So they started to realize that the killer was the star of the series. So this happens in Halloween. Myers becomes the star of it.
Yeah, it happens in Nightmare on Elm Street.
Exactly. And in Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
And it happens so much in Halloween, by the way, that so they make a sequel, which is, I think, good, not anywhere near the quality of the first one. Then they make the third one, which is just supposed to be a completely different film. It's an anthology now where we're just going to have different films. And people fucking despised it because they went to Halloween 3 thinking, I'm going to see Myers killing people,
right, and
there's no Myers to be found. So Mustafa Akkad, the producer and who had the rights to these films after Carpenter and Hill sold them to him, he's like, I don't give a shit what you do. I want Myers in the movie killing people.
Yes.
So that's what to me makes the slasher, the later like 80s slashers, the mid 80s especially, although some of these dumb ones that followed right here were bad, but like the Nightmare on Elm Streets, the Friday the 13th, and the Halloween, the later ones in the series, it's just giving us idiotic teenagers who are annoying that we actually want to get killed so that we feel good when they're dying.
Yes. Yeah. They become extremely formulaic quickly, and there's just nothing that I think it's interesting because, you know, there are only so many holidays that you can turn into.
Right.
Just it's not interesting anymore. You're not exploring interesting psychological issues or sociological issues.
Right.
Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre has some interesting underlying kind of sociology to it.
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah.
And you know, Black Christmas, same thing, explores issues around like abortion, feminism, alcoholism.
Yep.
And it's well written. Halloween is the most minimalist of the three films, but still there are interesting issues in there. And then
there's this whole aspect. People don't. I think this is if you were to focus on what's novel about the Halloween idea, right? The novelty is the metaphysical angle. Because I mean, you think of like all of these films, Black Christmas, Psycho, even like none of them have this aspect of something metaphysical going on. Halloween adds this. We take this for granted because then we got Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees who were unstoppable killers. But this
the indestructible killer that quickly becomes a trope.
Yeah, and then it's kind of like a parody of a parody at some point.
Right.
But in this film, it really works. It's really interesting, and it's this is what Rob Zombie doesn't understand, and why his Halloweens are so stupid, because he takes Michael Myers and he apparently watched Halloween and he was like, man, I want to know more about Michael Myers.
Right.
And so he turns him into this typical quote unquote white trash serial killer as Rob Zombie would. And it's just totally uninteresting at that point.
Right. And that's also what Kale missed about the movie. It's
Yes.
precisely the lack of a clear motive and the lack of a clear reason for choosing victims
Yes.
that makes Myers interesting. We don't know why he's choosing the victims. Also a huge failure. I mean, you can be as high on Halloween 2 as you want, but turning Laurie Strode into his sister was a terrible decision.
As Carpenter himself admits, he apparently came up with this idea after a few too many brewskis, and it was incredibly stupid. We should note that that's not in this film. So a lot of people think,
yeah, that's right.
Oh, Laurie is Michael Myers' other sister, and it makes sense because he killed Judith and now he's trying to kill her. No, not in this one. It's completely random.
Yes. I mean, it's not random, but it's like this stochastic.
Well, it's random in the sense that he just happened to see her.
Right.
She came up to the house and then he stalks her around.
Yeah. So and I agree with you. That's the power of this film is the metaphysical element, Dr. Loomis character, and the lack of a backstory. I think that Carpenter learned the correct lesson from Psycho. Don't explain it to everybody. Like there's mystery there. And the fact that that runs through the entire film and the way that they end it with him like not being dead and he's out there and we don't know where, that's the perfect way to do that.
Right. Completely agree, which is why I compare it. I think you can do the Moby Dick reading of Captain Ahab, played by Loomis in this one. It's Captain Ahab, and Myers is the white whale with whom he's obsessed. And there's just what is it? We don't know. It's just bad shit happens, man. Like you'd be walking and a tile falls on your head and kills you. That's what Myers is. Myers is the inexplicable element of doom or evil and fate, and all of these metaphysical things in the world that we can't explain but we don't like.
And to the conservative, to the criticism that these films are kind of inherently conservative, I think that there's a little something to that, because if you're living in suburban America, bourgeois, you generally tend to like your life, right? You like, family is important. You do have traditional values. Those are things that, most people are approve of. So I think it's almost necessary that these films have that, because you have to take something away that these people care about, right?
Well, you could, but you could argue. So yes, they're often like teenagers, bourgeois teenagers somewhere, a camp, small towns, right? It doesn't seem to work as well in the city, although they put Jason in New York for a little bit. But you could read it as a criticism of the hypocrisy, and in fact, I think there's some of that running through. Not so much Halloween, but definitely Nightmare on Elm Street, for example, and some of these other films where you get is really a criticism of the hypocrisy of the parents.
Yes.
Right? Who are alcoholics or whatever, are trying to deal with life, and they're not doing a very good job. And in some ways, they unleashed the killer on the children, or they don't pay attention to the children who are trying to warn them about the killer, right? This is something that plays out somewhat in some of the Friday the 13th films, like Friday the 13th 6, for example, where Tommy is in prison and he's claiming that this killer is coming, and they won't listen to him, or they think the kids themselves did it instead of the killer, which is something that happens in Nightmare on Elm Street.
Right.
So there's actually a lot of criticism of adults in these films.
Yes.
Which makes sense if you're aiming for, like teenagers go and they find this appealing and they're like, yeah, fuck our adult, fuck our parents or whatever.
That's my thought. Like some of this can be explained just quite, straightforwardly by what market are you trying to attract and how would you do that? Right?
Sure.
And we want these films to be told from the perspective of teenagers because we're
Right.
trying to appeal to teenagers, not adults.
Yes.
And to
Yes,
do that,
exactly.
well, how do you appeal to teenagers? You write the adult characters and they're buffoons and hypocrites.
Right. But also importantly, you want the people to be more vulnerable, and that means you have to kind of take the parents out to make them vulnerable. It's also why I think you often have more women characters because they seem more vulnerable. Although, I mean, one of the interesting things about the slasher genre, generally speaking, is what we've been talking about, this sort of final girl character.
Mhm.
And although you get some of this very over the top feminist criticism of slasher films for, objectifying women, and it's purveying this masculine gaze on women, or whatever it might be, the female characters are generally better than the male characters, and they're
Yes.
actually strong and courageous in a way that the male characters are. And
Yes.
so in some respects, you could argue that it's actually like pro-feminist. And I know Jamie Lee Curtis, for example, said, it's ironic that people criticize these as exploitation flicks, but actually this was the best role I had since or until True Lies, of this strong, honest, courageous character who paid attention to her surroundings and did the right thing.
Right. And I think that would fit with Nowell's economic analysis, right? That you were trying to specifically to appeal to this
Right.
large, relatively untapped audience of younger women.
Right.
And well, how are we going to do that? You're not going to do it just having a film about a bunch of macho, teenage doofus dudes. You're going to do
Right.
it by having three-dimensional, strongly written female characters, or at least whoever becomes the final girl. You want that character to be somebody you can identify, or younger girls can identify with.
Yeah, now that it should be said, like, as the genre degenerates into a celebration of the killer, the characters get worse and more repulsive and annoying and idiotic, and that is unfortunate. But it's not as if the women are more idiotic than the men, right? I mean, everybody becomes idiotic, just good looking eye candy to get slaughtered. And of
Right.
course, this is made fun of in so many films, including Scream, Cabin in the Woods, Tucker and Dale versus Evil. I mean, there are many films sort of mocking the slasher genre. And one
Yeah.
of the things we should say about just I mean, we've said this, but it's worth thinking about and interesting, is that unlike other genres, the slasher genre is just full of trash in a way that I think this is why people are so interested in this. Is how did you get this genre that was so popular and made so much money, but was full of so much schlock? I mean, other than a few films, you can point to Halloween, obviously, Black Christmas, Nightmare on Elm Street's 1 and 3, Friday the 13th, maybe 1 and 6.
Yeah, maybe.
And you can say, okay, these are, average, better than average, two great films. Other than that, almost every film in the genre is just pretty much garbage in terms of like objective quality. They can be watchable.
Yeah, it's true that the films are almost universally drac, and it's interesting to me how quickly the slasher ran its course. So you were getting meta slashers in
Yes.
the 80s, and especially
Yes.
obviously in the 90s, and Scream is the most famous example of that.
Right.
I actually think that the slasher genre or subgenre is just dead. Like, there's not actually a way that somebody could do an effective film that would be recognized as a slasher anymore.
Yeah,
I just don't think it's doable.
I disagree with that, but I guess what your argument is sort of the Jean Baudelaire I don't know how you say that in French, but like the simulacrum or something, like we're so hyper aware of the tropes of the genre that anything that we make is meta inevitably, right?
Yeah, and even you look at films like even the films where you're playing with the slasher genre
Mhm.
are getting like there's another layer of meta on them. So you
Right.
play with those. Or if you did a film where you follow like you earnestly followed the conventions of the slasher, it
Mhm.
would be meta on top of the meta, right? Like you know what I mean? Like
It
you
would be,
can't
yeah. It's like it's the condition of post-modernity, and that
right, like
you're
you're inverting
inevitably aware that you're aware, and there's no way to escape the
and
awareness.
so if the purpose of the slasher is to hit this youth market and to titillate and scare people, that's just not possible to do anymore with that formula. People are too used to it. Like a 17-year-old watches Halloween now and they say it's boring, right?
Some do,
That's
but
kind of
I'm gonna,
slow and boring.
yeah, but I actually, I just, I see what you're saying. I disagree with it to some extent, because I think if you had a gifted filmmaker,
Mhm.
you could make a good slasher film today. The problem is there aren't many talented filmmakers who are interested in that. And in fact, the dearth of talent in the genre itself was quite remarkable. You had, I mean, Wes Craven is held up and applauded as some master of horror when he's a mediocre director,
Mhm.
right? Because there's a paucity of talent there. Carpenter, I would argue, was the one real auteur who made a film in the genre. And it's
As a slasher film, you mean?
as a slasher film,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And it's
I
a
would agree with that.
masterpiece. I think if you had like a Coen Brothers team make a slasher in 2020, you could do it. You could make a very effective, very good slasher film. You would have to, of course, some things would have to change a little bit to make it scary or whatever, but you could definitely do it. And in fact, I would argue that the slasher film, especially the Halloween slasher film, the small town, eerie, there's some sort of evil lurking in this area, it's really been made by David Lynch, for example, in Blue Velvet, or some of the other independent filmmakers, just without the slasher killer. But you have the same sort of questions that you're raising, and the what you're dealing with, the horror that happens somewhere underneath the surface in this small town community. I think you could do a really good job with that. I've even thought about doing like a television series slasher where you do like 10 episodes, because what you could do is you could really you deal with the fallout of the deaths, because this is one thing you can't do in a 2-hour film, is really deal with the trauma of the deaths. You could do that in a 10 episode series, right? I think you could.
At that point, I don't think that's a slasher though. I think that's more of a mystery noir slash like suburban melodrama, right? You're
Yeah, but that's
taking in
what,
a lot of these like Sam Mendes, Douglas Sirk,
well, no,
right?
keep Mendes out of
But
this.
it's themes that are
Good director. It's Alan Ball, is who he wrote American Beauty. That's it.
oh, okay. So
Right, but some of these themes are in Halloween, is what I'm saying.
oh, I agree, but
Right, so you
those
could.
aren't the themes that make it a slasher though. So
No,
what
but
you're saying is
I,
basically you could create a film that had some slasher elements if it
yes.
focused on the kind of mystery and the community psychology and the kind of what lies beneath middle class bourgeois
Yes,
society.
but
Not a
important.
slasher anymore.
No, I strongly disagree, because mystery is a part of a lot of the slashers. If you Friday the 13th, who's the killer? That's the mystery. Now the characters aren't really trying to figure that out. We as the audience are, but Nightmare on Elm Street, mystery. Who's Freddy Krueger? Who is this guy who's killing people? And that's actually played up much more in the terrible remake of Nightmare on Elm Street that had a little bit of potential. And it really plays like a mystery film, right? They're trying to figure out who this killer is.
Yeah, I agree. But
right, I think that's it's an essential, or it's not an essential, but it's an important component of a lot of the slasher films, as
so
is this bourgeois, like these teenagers from a bourgeois background going somewhere where they're vulnerable.
yes. So the question would be, why does nobody do this then?
Yes, it's a good question. I agree. Well,
So your hypothesis is just sufficiently talented writers and or directors haven't become involved in these projects.
Yeah,
if they did, they could do a good job of it. It could still be a frightening film.
Could you imagine David Lynch in his peak powers, David Lynch doing a slasher? I mean, he could make a fucking brilliant slasher. I mean, really, if you look at Blue Velvet, it has a lot of these themes and this sort of horror element with the sort of force of evil in the movie. It really has a lot of that. I think, yes, if you had talented people working in the genre, you could get good films. The thing is, because of the economics of it, what we got is it's as if we had the Western without the John Fords, John Hustons, Sam Peckinpahs, if you like him, the Michael Manns, as if we
Anthony
had
Manns.
Anthony Mann, that Michael Mann, different director. It's as if we had the Western genre without that talent, and we were just looking at these B Westerns mostly.
You were just doing Andre de Toth Westerns.
Yes. And you said to me, you can't do the Western, we're past it, we did the meta Western. No, I really think it's a lack of talent. People aren't doing that for whatever reason. Horror went through the slasher genre. You didn't get a lot of talent in it. And then you did the meta slashers, and then you moved
mostly supernatural.
Yeah, you moved into like this kind of supernatural, and then the sort of torture porn, as you might call it, with the Hostel and Saw and some of those films. That's more about the grisly killings than some sort of any thematic interest with the characters.
So that's probably true. So to a large extent, people who are doing the slashers that are done now are almost universally deliberate, low budget exploitation films,
right?
That are niche. They're directed specifically at horror fans.
Yes,
right.
Yeah,
and that's a problem, is that the horror market is not that large, right? It's not as big as the market for action films.
Well, right, because it's it's R-rated, so you're right there.
It doesn't play well universally either.
Right, and I think that's why studios are reluctant to put a lot of money into these. But you do have Blumhouse making good horror films. But also, it just seems to be the case that a lot of auteurs are they're just not interested in slasher per se. That maybe they don't find it intellectually stimulating or whatever. But when they make a film, like I'll go back to Blue Velvet, because it has a lot of the themes of Halloween, right? This small town, the nature of good and evil, this metaphysical like presence of evil that haunts the town. But it's much different, and it's more creative in some sense than just having this psycho loose killer. But it could have that. It could illustrate those themes with that. And in fact,
right,
I like that Halloween does that, because Halloween basically takes the story that you would tell your friends at night to scare each other. This guy escaped from a mental hospital and he's out there. It takes that and uses that, such a generic story, as a way to explore some of these themes, right? That's what I like about it. And that's where when I think about like the film that I would make, and I think about the slasher film I would make, it's just taking that as a vehicle to explore more interesting themes.
Yeah, I think although in Halloween, the socio-political readings of it are real stretches, because actually in the film, like, there's no I don't even think there's like hidden political content,
Oh,
right?
yeah, I
There are
agree with
no,
that. Yeah.
basically no adults. It's just a middle class community.
Yes.
Uh, it's not as if domestic life is portrayed as having like these real hidden psychological tortures that
Yeah.
are covered up with a picket fence facade.
Right. No, the only thing there is like this question about what is evil, the sort of metaphysics of evil. Even in this small town, you're still vulnerable, I think, is the theme that is resonant. I agree that if you're a Marxist looking for some meat to consume in this film, you're going to be disappointed as you find empty bone because there's just nothing there for that.
Yeah, because it's clear that neither Carpenter nor Hill were
Yeah,
interested in all at like this kind of
right.
more political level of
E-
criticism.
Right, even though Carpenter did, clearly he has some political interest as the
They
film
live.
They Live illustrates, but it's not in
Yeah.
this one. And in fact, I like it that it's not there. I like it that it's very minimalistic. It doesn't try to do too much. It doesn't introduce all of these kinds of themes. It just really focuses laser-like on what it's doing.
Yeah, it's I agree. It's basically it's a slice of teenage life film combined with a meditation on the nature of evil. Like
Right.
these two put together in an extremely effective way.
Yes, agreed.
That
So
would be, yeah, my final analysis. I think that's about
yeah,
right.
that
And
that's my final analysis too. Brilliant film, minimalist, beautiful to look at, excellent cinematography, just brilliant composition, interesting long takes, wide shots, just very well done. Knocked down a little bit by some pretty bad dialogue and a little inexperienced acting.
yep, agreed. And I would say, as with all truly great masterpiece films, there's a relatively large degree of fortuitousness and
Yes.
and serendipity and how they come together. And that's for the better. That
Yeah.
you can't. There's not like an algorithm that you run and you get like Halloween
You
or
right. You
Citizen
just
Kane.
figure anytime you have a real legit masterpiece, everything had to work just the right way to get it, right? It's like the Anna Karenina principle, right? However, there's like one way to make a masterpiece. There
Right.
are millions of ways to make a shitty film.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
everything just has to come together in the right way to make a masterpiece.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. So we will see you
Yeah,
next
next
time.
time we're gonna do The Founder starring Michael Keaton. Just a
What
great film.
we consider this to be one of the overlooked films of the
Yes.
last 5 years. So we
Yes.
will get into that, and we'll see you next time on Cinemapod.